I remember the first time I saw the cabin standing quietly at the edge of the forest, its outline softened by the early evening haze. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and dusty rose. The air smelled of damp pine needles, moss, and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. Each breath I took felt heavier than the last, not from strain, but from the density of the forest itself. It was almost as if the trees were holding their own secrets in the shadows, pressing close without moving. The road to the cabin had been nothing more than a dirt path, narrow and winding, with roots curling up through the ground like the hands of restless sleepers reaching for the sky. My car's tires crunched softly against the gravel, the only sound that seemed to break the thick silence of the woods. With every turn, I felt the world I knew, the small, bustling town I'd left behind, slip further away, swallowed by the forest that seemed endless and patient. I parked beside the cabin, its weathered wood glowing faintly in the last light of day. The structure was small, simple, a single story with a steep, shingled roof and a stone chimney that promised warmth, though no smoke rose from it yet. I stepped out, feeling the air settle around me, and I noticed the silence. Not the kind of quiet you find in a library where hushed voices hover in the air, but the kind of quiet that feels alive, aware. The forest seemed to listen as I moved, each snap of a twig under my boot, a loud echo in a world without other sound. I ran my hand along the wooden railing of the porch. The texture was rough and uneven, the grain of the wood worn smooth in some places by years of exposure and jagged in others, a reminder of storms and time. There was a faint, earthy scent clinging to it, the smell of rain that had soaked into the wood long ago and never left. I inhaled slowly, letting the smell fill my senses, grounding me, even as a subtle unease started to unfurl in my chest. The door creaked as I opened it, and inside the cabin smelled like cedar and dust, and a faint lingering tang of smoke, as if a fire had burned here long ago but never fully died. The floorboards groaned under my weight, sending shivers up my spine, though there was no one here to hear them. I could feel the history of the place in the very air, years of quiet nights, of someone watching the stars from this very porch, of conversations whispered in the shadows. It was comforting and disquieting at the same time, like a lullaby sung by someone just out of reach. I walked slowly through the main room, my fingers brushing against the edges of the furniture. The cabin was furnished simply. A wooden table with uneven legs, 2 chairs pulled neatly to its sides, a small hearth empty of fire, its bricks darkened by smoke and age. Light from the setting sun filtered in through the small windows, scattering golden shards across the worn floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, and I watched them for a while, letting the stillness sink into my bones. There was a sense of expectation in the air, though I couldn't say what it was. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. The way the light and shadows moved through the trees, the way sounds echo differently when there's nothing else to compare them to. But still, I couldn't help the sensation that someone or something had been here, watching the same sunset, feeling the same quiet. I made my way to the back of the cabin, where a narrow window looked out onto the denser part of the forest. The trees pressed close here, their dark silhouettes forming a wall that seemed to hum softly with life. I leaned my forehead against the glass, feeling the coolness seep into my skin, and listened. For a long moment, there was only the whisper of the wind through the needles and the occasional bird calling to its mate before the night fully claimed the sky. Then faintly, I thought I heard something else, like the soft brush of a branch against bark, too deliberate to be random. I pulled back, telling myself it was nothing, just a branch settling, just a deer moving among the pines. I explored the small bedroom next, running my hands along the quilted blanket on the bed, feeling the uneven stitching, the faint smell of old linen. The window there framed the forest differently, more open, as if inviting me to step outside, to wander deeper among the trees. I could see the way the last light touched the tops of the pines, and I imagined shadows stretching long and thin across the ground, reaching toward the cabin, circling it. My heart rate slowed as I tried to breathe normally, But the forest had a way of making every sound intimate, personal. Every creak of the cabin's frame, every rustle beyond the glass, became part of a conversation only I could hear. There was a small kitchen area, no bigger than a closet, with a wood-burning stove, a chipped enamel sink, and a cupboard filled with mismatched dishes. I opened the stove door and saw the blackened interior, charred from fires long extinguished. I could almost imagine the cabin's previous occupants, lighting the stove against the chill, speaking quietly to one another, sharing meals and stories in this little wooden box amid the vast forest. And then, almost immediately, I wondered if the cabin remembered them. If the walls, the floorboards, the air itself kept the memory of those who'd lived here, who'd vanished here. Stepping outside again, I noticed the air had cooled considerably. Twilight had deepened into a gentle, dusky blue, and the forest seemed to close in just slightly more. The smell of pine was stronger now, mingled with the damp scent of the soil, rich and almost sweet. I walked slowly along the small path leading away from the cabin, feeling the uneven ground beneath my boots. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of the corner of my eye, the trees bending slightly, as if leaning toward me. I told myself I was imagining it, that the forest played tricks with fading light, and yet a shiver ran down my spine. I paused at the edge of a small clearing. The cabin was just behind me, its outline stark against the dimming sky. I could hear the faint creak of the porch under the weight of unseen footsteps, or maybe just the wind. I inhaled the cold evening air, letting the smell of pine fill my lungs. There was a comforting aspect to the solitude, to being alone in this place where the world had seemingly paused. But there was also something else, subtle and persistent, curling in the edges of my mind. A feeling that the cabin itself had watched me arrive, that it was waiting for something or someone. Returning to the cabin, I lit a small lantern I had brought with me. The warm glow cast dancing shadows across the walls, making the familiar furniture look strange and unsteady. The corners of the room deepened into darkness, and I could hear the wind shifting outside, rustling the tops of the trees. It was a calm sound, but there was an undercurrent of unease, as though the forest was breathing alongside me, aware of my presence. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the lantern, letting the quiet sink into me. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but alive. And as the last light of day finally disappeared behind the forest, I realized I was holding my breath. I hadn't noticed until that moment the way the world had gone still, waiting for night to fully settle, waiting for me to notice that the forest didn't just surround the cabin. It held it, kept it, watched over it. And though it was silent, I could almost feel it breathing with me. The slow, gentle exhale of an unseen presence, patient, patient, patient. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the calm, letting the tension in my shoulders soften, letting the scent of pine, wood, and damp earth wash over me. There was comfort here, yes, but a sharp edge to it too. The kind of place that is home to memories, to secrets, to things long gone yet lingering. And somewhere deep in the forest, beyond the clearing and the cabin, I could feel the night waiting. Not cruelly, not violently, but inevitably, like a tide rising to meet the shore. I stayed there a long while, listening to the quiet, letting it speak without words. And slowly, I understood that the cabin at twilight was not just a building. It was a threshold, a pause between the world I had left behind and the forest that would embrace me completely when darkness fell. And in that silence, I felt both safe and watched. I woke to the soft, muffled sound of snow pressing against the cabin roof. It was subtle, almost gentle, the way the world outside had been swallowed by a soft white blanket. The early morning light had not yet fully reached the clearing, and the forest was hushed, almost reverent under its coat of frost. I slipped from the bed, careful not to disturb the quiet, and drew back the curtain to look at the world beyond the window. The ground was untouched at first glance. Snow stretched evenly across the clearing, smooth and pure, reflecting the pale gray of the sky. And then I saw them, tracks. Small, uneven footprints leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin and then stopping abruptly near the porch. I blinked, thinking I must be mistaken. The snow was fresh, untouched by wind or animal, and yet here were footprints, deliberate and oddly precise. I stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and followed the trail. The prints were human in shape, though something about them was off. Too small, too narrow, as if someone or something had moved lightly, deliberately, taking care not to disturb the surrounding snow more than necessary. I traced them toward the tree line, where the forest began again, dark and silent. The air was colder here, sharper, and my breath came out in long, visible puffs, fading quickly into the stillness. There was no wind, no movement in the trees, only the faint whisper of snow falling from branches heavy with frost. The tracks disappeared among the pines, as though the forest itself had swallowed them. I stood there for a moment, my eyes straining to see through the thin gray light, and felt a subtle shift in the air. Not wind, not temperature, but a weight. Something attentive just beyond my perception, lingering at the edge of my vision. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as nerves, as the natural tension of being alone in a place like this. I returned to the cabin, my mind replaying the tracks. How had they appeared? No one else was supposed to be here. The cabin was isolated for miles in every direction. I thought of animals, deer, foxes, but the prints were too deliberate, too human, and they didn't match anything I knew from tracking guides I'd glanced through online. And then, almost without thinking, I realized that what unnerved me most wasn't the prints themselves, but the way the forest seemed to respond to them. The silence wasn't natural anymore. It was watching. Inside, I tried to focus on small, grounding tasks. I brewed tea, listening to the kettle hiss and bubble, letting the warm steam rise between us. I ran my fingers along the wooden table, tracing the rings in the grain, and imagined the hands that had worn them smooth over the years. The forest beyond the windows was brightening slowly, but each shadow felt deliberate now, stretching across the snow in strange, impossible ways. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I returned to the window, looking for the tracks again, but they were gone. It was as if they had never existed, erased by magic or some quiet will of the forest. I pressed my forehead against the glass, trying to see what had left them, trying to convince myself of a rational explanation. Maybe a traveler had passed in the night. Maybe it had been the wind shifting the snow in strange patterns. And yet, deep down, I knew the truth felt different. The tracks had been deliberate. They had meant to be noticed, or perhaps to be followed. The rest of the morning passed in a tense sort of limbo. I kept moving around the cabin, performing small tasks, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. I swept the floorboards, wiped the dust from the windows, and arranged the furniture slightly differently. Each movement was measured, deliberate, as if the cabin itself was observing, and any mistake might draw attention. Every sound outside, every groan of the wood beneath my feet, became amplified in my imagination. The forest beyond was alive, patient, and impossibly still, and I could feel its presence pressing against the thin walls. By mid-morning, the snow had stopped falling, and a pale sun began to filter through the clouds. I thought I would find relief in the light, but instead it made the shadows sharper, darker, more purposeful. The prints should have been visible now, easy to follow in the fresh snow, yet the clearing was empty, immaculate. My unease grew in the absence of evidence. The forest had swallowed the truth, and all that remained was the lingering feeling of being watched, of being alone with a presence that didn't belong to this world, or at least not to mine. I stepped outside again, boots crunching on the snow, and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I traced imaginary lines where the footprints should have led, careful not to disturb the surface too much myself. Every snapped twig, every shifted clump of snow made me flinch. I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to, and I let it out slowly, deliberately, listening to the hollow echo it left behind. There was no answer. Nothing moved, but the weight in the air remained, heavy and unyielding. As I rounded the cabin a second time, I noticed something I had not seen before, a faint indentation in the snow near the back porch. It was subtle, shallow, almost as if someone had knelt there for only a moment, but enough to catch my attention. I crouched, brushing the surface lightly with gloved fingers. The snow had hardened slightly, preserving the impression. There was no mud, no scuffing, nothing to suggest a hurried exit or a careless visitor. just a marked, deliberate silence. I felt a strange mixture of curiosity and dread as I traced the indentation with my eyes. Whoever, or whatever, had been here had known I would notice it. They had left it intentionally as a sign, or perhaps as a warning. My mind tried to fill in the gaps, constructing scenarios each more unsettling than the last. I imagined a person, small and careful, slipping through the woods, watching me from a distance, unseen yet near. I imagined shapes in the trees, branches bending toward me without wind, guiding my gaze. And I imagined silence so complete that it felt like it was breathing alongside me. Returning to the cabin, I shut the door carefully, pressing my shoulder against it to make sure it was secure. Inside, the warmth from the lantern and the small stove offered some comfort, but it did little to ease the tension that had settled in my chest. I paced slowly, trying to normalize my breathing, reminding myself that the forest was just trees, snow, and cold air. Rational explanations existed. They were there if only I could quiet my mind long enough to see them. By afternoon, a dull unease had set in, a lingering pressure in my shoulders and neck. I sat near the window, the view of the forest unchanging, and allowed myself to close my eyes for a few moments. I imagined warmth, the sensation of sunlight on my skin, the hum of life far away in the town I had left. But even in that brief escape, I could feel the forest around me. It was patient, waiting, observing. The tracks in the snow, whether real or imagined, had changed everything. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a threshold, and I had crossed it. The evening came slowly, stretching the shadows across the clearing. I lit the lantern again, letting the amber glow fill the corners of the room. Outside, the snow began to fall lightly once more, settling onto the ground in soft, even layers. I could feel the subtle presence lingering at the edges of the clearing, just beyond sight, and it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't violent and it wasn't malicious. It was patient, like the forest itself, or like someone who had always been there, waiting. I stayed near the window for a long while, listening to the snow, watching the way it drifted silently through the trees. Every now and then I thought I heard a faint crunch beneath the falling flakes, but when I looked, nothing moved. My mind wandered, tracing the possible paths the footprints could have taken, imagining the presence moving around the cabin, circling, patient and quiet. The forest was alive in a way I could not fully comprehend, and the snow was its signature, marking the arrival of something unseen. As night fell, I felt the weight of the presence deepen. The cabin, so comforting in the daylight, seemed smaller now, more intimate, more vulnerable. Every shadow was deliberate, every sound significant. The snow outside continued to settle, erasing evidence, preserving mystery. And I understood with a clarity that made my chest tighten that the tracks were not meant to be followed in the ordinary sense. They were an introduction, a reminder that the forest was patient, and that I was no longer alone. I sat back in my chair, letting the lantern light warm my hands, and listened. The forest had a rhythm, a slow, quiet pulse. It was not threatening, not directly, but it was aware. It remembered, and somewhere in the snow, just beyond my vision, the footsteps lingered. I had been wandering the cabin for hours, letting my curiosity guide me through every corner, every creaking floorboard. The snow outside had softened into a quiet drizzle that blurred the edges of the clearing. And the forest beyond seemed even more still than before, as if holding its breath. Inside, the cabin felt warmer now, the lantern casting gentle, flickering light that made the shadows sway lazily along the walls. I thought I was beginning to feel comfortable again, settling into the rhythm of the small, quiet space. It was while I was examining the far corner of the main room that I noticed the attic door. I had walked past it before, a small, nondescript wooden panel near the ceiling, almost hidden by a shelf of dusty books and a faded tapestry. But now it seemed different, more deliberate, like it had been waiting for me to notice. The wood was dark, aged, and the brass latch glinted faintly in the lantern light. I reached for it instinctively, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, and felt a shiver travel down my spine. The latch wouldn't budge. I jiggled it lightly, then pressed harder, but it held fast, stubborn and unyielding. I tried to reason it away, telling myself that it was simply locked, that the previous occupant had used it for storage, nothing more. But even as I did, I felt the shift in the air around me. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, like the exhale of a hidden presence. I froze, listening. And then I heard it, soft, whispering voices, drifting down through the ceiling, subtle enough that I could have convinced myself I imagined them. I leaned closer to the door, tilting my ear against the wood. The whispers grew slightly clearer, though still muffled, distant. They weren't words I could recognize, not fully, but they had rhythm, intent, cadence. Like someone trying to speak across time, across a distance I couldn't measure. My heart began to beat faster, but not in panic. It was a slow, steady awareness, a reminder that I was no longer just a visitor in this cabin. I was intruding into something private, something preserved in the wood and shadows. I stepped back, running my fingers along the wall for support. My mind began to fill with possibilities, some rational, some less so. Perhaps it was the wind moving through hidden cracks in the roof, or the settling of the cabin under the weight of snow. Maybe it was the memory of the forest outside, imprinting itself into my imagination. And yet deep down I knew this was different. The sound carried intention, subtle, deliberate, patient. I circled the room slowly, trying to observe the door without staring at it, as if acknowledging it too directly might draw something out. The whispers persisted, soft and constant, like distant conversations I had no right to hear. I could feel them pressing gently against my awareness, brushing against the edges of thought, and I realized with a strange clarity that the cabin itself had layers I was not meant to explore. I was skimming the surface, and the attic, the locked attic, was the heart of it. The lantern flickered, sending brief, stretching shadows across the ceiling. I thought I saw them move independently, thin shapes twisting against the wood, brushing along the rafters. I told myself it was the play of light, nothing more. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave the room. There was a pull, subtle and insistent, drawing my attention back to the attic door, to the whispers that now felt almost like names, half remembered, on the edge of comprehension. I ran my fingers over the latch again, this time more deliberately. The metal was cold, almost alive under my touch, and I imagined it had held countless secrets. Perhaps the previous occupants had stored things there they never wanted discovered. Perhaps it was the attic that listened, and the rest of the cabin was simply a frame to distract the careless eye. I could feel the history in the wood, the stories pressed into every knot, every splinter. It was a slow, creeping awareness that I could not ignore. I stepped away from the door, walking to the window that looked out over the clearing. The snow had shifted, forming patterns that seemed almost intentional. Footprints perhaps from animals or perhaps something else. The whispers remained faint, layered into the quiet, and I realized that each time I moved, each time I spoke, I was a part of it now. I could not leave, not fully. I had crossed a threshold the moment I noticed the attic. The cabin had acknowledged me. I thought of leaving, stepping outside, returning to the world I had left behind. But even the thought brought unease. The forest was patient, yes, but it was also watchful. The clearing, the cabin, the trees beyond, they had learned to wait. And I knew that if I left without exploring the attic, without trying to understand what lay beyond the locked door, a piece of my mind would remain behind, tethered to the whispers that now seemed to follow me in my own thoughts. I walked back to the attic door and pressed my ear against it once more. The whispers seemed clearer now, forming shapes and syllables just beyond my grasp. I could not tell if they were warnings or invitations, threats or confessions. I closed my eyes and imagined the previous occupant standing here, doing exactly what I was doing now, listening, wondering. Perhaps they had known what lay behind the door. Perhaps they had locked it for good reason. And yet, something about the soft cadence of the voices made me want to know. I ran my hands over the surrounding wall, tracing the grain of the wood, trying to ground myself in texture and reality. My breathing had slowed, becoming deliberate, measured. The whispers ebbed and flowed like waves against a distant shore, never fully forming into clarity. And in that murmur I felt the cabin's presence, patient and aware, acknowledging my attention, almost approving it. It was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that I was a guest in a place that had its own will. Hours passed without my realizing it. I moved from the attic door to the windows to the hearth, touching each surface, noting the imperfections in the wood, the faded stains on the floor. Every time I returned to the attic, the whispers seemed to adjust, shifting subtly, as if responding to my curiosity. I began to recognize patterns, rhythmic pulses that matched my own heartbeat, or perhaps dictated it. The cabin had its own life, its own breathing, and I was beginning to understand that the attic was the center of it, the heart that pulsed quietly beneath the surface. As evening fell, the light outside softened, the snow reflecting a pale, silver glow that seeped into the room. I sat near the door, listening, letting the whispers wash over me. There was no fear here now, not the kind that makes your hands tremble or your chest tight. This was a slow, patient dread, the kind that nestles into your mind and refuses to leave. The attic was not just a door. It was a threshold, a barrier between the world I understood and the world I was beginning to sense. I imagined the attic filled with objects, memories, maybe even echoes of those who had come before me. Old furniture, personal belongings, letters, perhaps even evidence of crimes long forgotten. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but it was not terror. It was curiosity mingled with unease, the kind of sensation that makes your pulse quicken just slightly, enough to remind you that you are alive, that you are aware. I could hear the forest beyond the cabin, its quiet rhythm uninterrupted by the snow or the wind. The trees seemed taller now, darker, pressing closer to the cabin's walls. And through it all, the whispers persisted, patient and deliberate, threading through my thoughts like a slow melody I could almost understand if I listened long enough. I rested my forehead against the door one last time, letting the cold wood press against my skin. The whispers were clear now, just beyond comprehension, teasing shapes of words, fragments of past lives. I understood fully that I could not ignore them. I could not leave the attic unexplored forever. And yet the door remained locked, solid, patient, as if waiting for the exact moment I was ready, or perhaps waiting for the moment it chose to allow me in. I stepped back, letting the lantern light fall across the floorboards, the walls, the faint outlines of furniture, and took a deep breath. The cabin was quiet again. The whispers softened into background hum, and I realized I had settled into a rhythm with the space. I was a part of it now, connected to its history and its secrets, and the attic waited, patient, knowing I would return. The night outside deepened, snow falling softly, wrapping the clearing in quiet. And inside, I sat with the locked attic, the gentle murmur of voices threading through my mind, a constant reminder that some doors are meant to be noticed before they are opened, and some secrets are patient enough to wait. Night had fully settled over Pine Hollow by the time I realized just how silent everything had become. The wind had died down, and the last traces of daylight had faded into a soft, inky blue that pressed against the edges of the forest. From the cabin window, I could see the trees, tall and motionless, their dark forms blending into one another like a wall of shadows. Even the snow seemed quieter now, blanketing the ground in a muted stillness that amplified every sound, no matter how small. I had tried to keep busy, tidying the cabin, arranging the furniture, lighting the lantern to chase the shadows away. But no matter how much light I brought into the room, the darkness outside seemed patient, unyielding, as if it were waiting for me to notice it fully. My own movements felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards, every tap of the lantern against the table echoing in the quiet. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, or if the forest was somehow listening, measuring, aware of my presence in a way that felt intrusive. I sat by the window, letting the soft amber glow of the lantern fill the room behind me, and tried to steady my thoughts. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the ground smooth and untouched once more. At first glance, the clearing seemed empty, unbroken. But then I noticed something in the corner of my vision, a flicker of movement, too brief to be a deer, too purposeful to be random. I froze, holding my breath, and waited. The shadow didn't move again, not immediately. But I could feel it, lingering at the edge of my perception, just beyond the trees. It was subtle, just a dark shape blending into darker branches, and yet it carried intent. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a rabbit, but the movement was deliberate, patient, almost calculating. My chest tightened, not in fear exactly, but in awareness, as if the forest had become something larger, watching, knowing more than I did. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window, the chill seeping into my palm, and I could feel a strange connection with that shadow. It existed because I had seen it, and I existed because it waited. I leaned back, trying to ground myself, reminding myself of rational explanations. The wind could make shadows shift. My eyes could play tricks on me in low light. But I knew deep in my bones that this was different. This wasn't a trick of the eyes or a fleeting illusion. Something or someone was out there, patient, silent, and aware. And for reasons I could not comprehend, it had chosen to remain unseen, letting me wonder, letting me notice, letting me feel its presence. I moved slowly through the cabin, touching familiar objects to remind myself that this was my world, at least for the time being. The wooden table felt solid beneath my fingers, the chair beneath me grounded me, and the lantern's warmth offered a fragile comfort. Yet every time I returned to the window, the shadows in the forest seemed to shift subtly, as though the trees themselves were adjusting to my gaze, leaning just enough to conceal or reveal. I could feel the forest breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that matched my own heartbeat, patient and unrelenting. I thought back to the tracks in the snow from the morning, how they had appeared and then vanished, leaving only the memory of their existence. Now in the deep night, I could see the forest as a larger, more deliberate pattern of observation. Every tree, every branch, every shadow could be part of a watchful system, marking my movements, nodding my reactions. It was not hostile, not openly threatening, but there was a presence, a quiet insistence that made me feel watched without a face, followed without footsteps. At some point, I found myself at the cabin door, stepping onto the porch, lantern in hand. The cold air wrapped around me immediately, crisp and biting, and I could see my breath hanging in front of me in short, misty clouds. The snow sparkled faintly in the dim moonlight, reflecting pale silver and blue, and for a moment the world seemed calm again. But the silence was heavy, deliberate, and I knew that the shadows I had glimpsed from the window were still there, beyond the reach of the lantern's light. I walked slowly to the edge of the clearing, boots crunching softly in the snow. The trees loomed close now, forming a dense wall that swallowed the clearing. And then, without any warning, I saw it, movement again, faint but unmistakable. Not a flicker, not a trick of the snow, but a figure, distant, still mostly obscured, and yet deliberate. It moved slightly, as if testing my attention, then froze again, perfectly still, blending seamlessly into the darkness. I could feel my pulse in my ears, steady and anxious, a reminder that I was alive, that I had noticed. I didn't move closer. I didn't want to. There was a strange compulsion to look, to study, to understand, but something in me resisted. I stayed where I was, feeling the snow beneath my boots, the cold air on my skin, the forest pressing inward. And as I watched, the figure shifted again, more deliberate this time, and I realized it was not a single shadow. There were multiple, thin, elongated shapes, fleeting and impossible to count, moving slowly at the edge of perception. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply existed, patient and silent, as if waiting for something I could not name. The feeling of being observed grew heavier. I could sense it in every small sound, in every subtle shift in the forest. Even the snow, which had seemed comforting in its quiet, now felt like a layer separating me from a larger truth. I could not see everything, could not understand everything, but the sense of being watched, of existing within their awareness, was undeniable. It pressed against my thoughts in a slow, insistent way, like water slowly filling a vessel, gentle but inescapable. I returned to the cabin and closed the door, the warmth of the lantern immediately wrapping around me. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to steady my breath, to convince myself of rational explanations, but the unease persisted. Every time I glanced at the window, even from the safety of the room, I felt those unseen eyes at the edge of the forest, patient, deliberate. And then, for the first time, I heard a faint sound, not in the snow, not in the trees, but from within the forest itself. A soft, almost imperceptible rustle, like fabric brushing against bark, a careful movement, as though the shadows themselves were shifting closer to the clearing. I sat back in the chair, letting the lantern light wash over me, and tried to make sense of it. The forest was alive, yes, but not in the way I had imagined. It was conscious in its own way, aware, patient, and it had been watching me long before I arrived. I thought of the locked attic, of the footprints in the snow, and the whispers I had heard earlier. Pine Hollow was not just a forest or a cabin. It was a space of observation, of presence, and I had been noticed from the moment I arrived. The night deepened further. Shadows stretched long and dark across the clearing, intertwining with the shapes I could sense but not fully see. The forest seemed to exhale around me, slow, measured, a rhythm I had no control over. I understood then that the shadows were not here to scare me, not in a sudden, dramatic way. They were patient. They existed to be observed and to observe. I was part of their world now, or perhaps they were part of mine. I couldn't sleep that night, not fully. I lay in bed with the lantern beside me, eyes tracing the shifting shadows on the ceiling, my mind filling in shapes, half-remembered figures, imagined movements. I told myself it was the imagination, the isolation, the quiet snow, and the trees pressing close. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The forest, Pine Hollow, the cabin, it was aware. And somewhere in the dark, those shapes waited, patient and unhurried, observing, deliberate, knowing I had seen them. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but I could feel them at the edge of my vision, lingering, patient. The last light of Pine Hollow had gone, leaving only the faint glow of the lantern and the dark rhythm of the forest beyond. And in that darkness, I realized that I had crossed a threshold I could not unsee. The shadows would remain, waiting, and I would remain aware of them. It was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was. And so I waited, listening to the slow, steady pulse of the forest, letting the quiet press in, and knowing, somewhere deep in my mind, that I was being watched, always patiently, from the edges of the trees, from the corners of the clearing, from the last light of Pine Hollow. The forest road was narrower than I expected, twisting sharply between towering pines that seemed to close in above me, their branches forming a dark canopy that filtered the late afternoon sun into thin, uneven slivers. The air smelled damp, earthy, heavy with moss and fallen needles, and the occasional creak of a distant branch sounded startlingly close, as though the trees themselves were observing my progress. I drove slowly, unsure if I wanted to arrive too quickly, or if the road was trying to warn me away. Finally, the lodge appeared. It was set back from the road, partially hidden by thick growth. Its wooden exterior faded to a dull gray, with dark streaks where rain had run over the years. A small sign, half-wrought and barely legible, read Pinebrook Lodge. The windows were dark, some with cracked panes, and the front door hung slightly askew, revealing a shadowed interior. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching softly beneath my boots. The forest around me felt impossibly still, as if holding its breath, and I realized immediately that this place had a weight to it, a history that lingered in the air like dust, dense and unavoidable. A man emerged from the side of the lodge, moving slowly, leaning on a cane. He was older than I first noticed, hunched slightly, with gray hair slicked back and eyes that seemed to have watched too much of the world. He wore a thick wool coat, patched in places, and his boots were caked with mud from the surrounding forest. He stopped a few steps from me, surveying me with a long, quiet stare. "You're here for the lodge," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if the trees themselves had absorbed his words before they reached my ears. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "I was hoping to stay a night or just to see the place." He nodded slowly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Few stay long anymore," he said. "Not after incidents, but if you must, I'll show you to a room. Just be careful." There was an odd hesitation there, a pause heavy with unspoken meaning, and I felt my chest tighten slightly. I didn't press him for details, sensing that whatever stories he carried were not freely given. As we entered the lodge, the smell of old wood and mildew hit me first. It was not unpleasant, not fully, but it carried a weight of abandonment, a lingering memory of what the place had once been. The floorboards groaned beneath our steps, and I noticed small piles of leaves and pine needles that had blown through broken windows and gaps in the walls. Dust motes floated lazily in the fading light, and I could almost imagine the history pressing against every surface, every corner. The caretaker led me down a narrow hallway, stopping to point out rooms with doors hanging loosely on their hinges. "They mostly stayed on the east wing," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the ceiling and walls as if checking for ghosts. "Most guests didn't leave as planned. Some disappeared before breakfast, some in the middle of the night. I've told the authorities before, but they never stayed long enough to see it for themselves." He shook his head, but the movement was slight, almost imperceptible, like he was trying not to disturb the quiet that seemed to hum between the walls. I followed him without speaking, letting my eyes wander over the faded wallpaper, the once grand chandeliers now coated in dust, the frames on the walls crooked and empty. I felt the weight of the forest pressing against the lodge from every side, the sense that the building was part of a larger system of observation. Shadows clung to corners, stretching thin and long, following us silently. We reached a room near the end of the hallway, the door hanging unevenly but still functional. "This one's fine," he said, pushing it open. The room was small, furnished simply, a bed with a sagging mattress, a rickety chair, a wooden dresser with a cracked mirror. Faded curtains hung limply over the window, and the light from the late afternoon cast long, shifting shadows across the floor. "You'll be alone," he added softly, almost apologetically. "I'll leave you to settle in. And listen. Pay attention to the small things." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. He lingered for a moment, watching me arrange my belongings, then straightened slowly and walked back down the hallway. His footsteps faded, replaced by the subtle, constant creak of the lodge itself settling, the soft whisper of the wind through broken panes, and the occasional distant tapping of what might have been branches against the roof. Alone, I explored the room slowly, touching the surfaces, feeling the age of the wood, the cold metal of the window latch, the brittle fabric of the curtains. Every detail seemed intentional, like the lodge itself was conscious of my presence, noting my movements, measuring my reactions. I could feel the weight of the caretaker's words in the back of my mind. Pay attention to the small things. And I realized that I was already noticing patterns I couldn't fully understand. Outside, the forest had grown dark, the snow from earlier winters now long melted, leaving only the wet, moss-covered earth and fallen leaves. Through the window, I could see the silhouettes of the trees, bending slightly in a wind I could barely feel. I thought I glimpsed movement, a shadow, perhaps another human, or maybe just a trick of the fading light. My chest tightened again, and I stepped back, letting my eyes adjust, reminding myself to breathe slowly, deliberately. I sat on the edge of the bed, lantern light brushing over the walls, and tried to quiet my mind. The caretaker's stories hovered in my thoughts, vague and unsettling. Disappearances, guests who never returned, warnings not meant to be directly understood. I thought about the way the forest pressed against the lodge, how the building seemed alive, aware. There was no immediate threat, not in a sudden, dramatic way, but the patient observation, the sense of being watched, was undeniable. I wandered toward the window again, curious despite my unease. The forest was dense, endless, a dark sea of trunks and branches. Every so often, I thought I glimpsed movement just beyond the edge of perception. A shadow shifting slightly, a branch bending in a way that seemed too deliberate, too precise. I pressed my palm to the glass, letting the cold seep into my skin, and tried to remind myself that isolation played tricks on the mind. But even with that rationalization, the feeling persisted. I was being observed. Not by one person, perhaps not by anyone I could name, but by something patient, deliberate, and aware. As night fell fully, the lodge seemed to breathe around me. The walls creaked softly, the floorboards groaned, and I could hear faint, irregular noises from the upper floors. Perhaps rats, or perhaps the lodge itself settling after years of disuse. I imagined guests moving in those hallways long ago, unaware of the forest pressing in, unaware of the shadows that lingered just beyond sight. Their absence was tangible, a residue in the very air. I lit a small lantern I had brought with me, the warm glow carving paths through the shadows of the room. The flickering light cast thin, shifting shapes along the walls, elongating and twisting with each movement. I could see the edges of the darkened hallway beyond my door, the faint outlines of the furniture, and I knew that even in light, the lodge held secrets. Shadows persisted, patient and unhurried, not aggressive, not demanding, but insisting on attention, on awareness. I sat on the bed, letting the lantern light warm my hands, and tried to think of the caretaker's warnings. Pay attention to the small things. What had he meant? The shadows in the trees, the shifting shapes in the hallway, the faint creaks in the floorboards, the cold drafts that seemed to appear without reason. Everything felt deliberate, part of a larger pattern, something older and patient. I imagined the guests who had vanished. Where had they gone? What had they seen? Were they still part of the lodge in some way, existing in those spaces between observation and disappearance, caught in the rhythm of the building itself? The thought sent a shiver through me, but I also felt a pull, a subtle curiosity that made me want to explore, to watch, to understand, even as my rational mind whispered caution. Hours passed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The forest outside remained dark and silent, the wind whispering occasionally through broken windows, brushing against the lodge's walls. The shadows inside seemed to respond to my presence, shifting, stretching, observing. I realized that staying here was not a neutral act. By noticing, by existing within the lodge, I had entered a dialogue with it, however subtle, however patient. As midnight approached, the weight of the forest and the building pressed fully upon me. I could feel the history in the walls, the memories pressed into the wood, the residual awareness of those who had come before. And through it all, I understood that Pinebrook Lodge was not just abandoned. It was aware, deliberate, patient, and I had become part of its slow, quiet rhythm. I lay on the bed, lantern beside me, and listened. The faint creaks and whispers of the lodge, the subtle rustle of branches outside, the patient quiet of the forest, all blended into a rhythm that was both comforting and unsettling. And in that rhythm, I felt the presence of the vanished guests, the attentive eyes of the caretaker, and the patient, watchful stillness of the lodge itself. I understood that my awareness had consequences, that by noticing, by being here, I had stepped into the lodge's pattern, and that it would not let me leave untouched. I had barely slept that first night at Pinebrook Lodge, though I tried. The faint groan of the floorboards, the creaking of rafters, even the whisper of the wind through broken windows, all of it seemed to settle into the edges of my mind, keeping me awake. When morning finally came, a pale, gray light filtering through the dusty curtains, I felt both exhausted and strangely alert. The caretaker had disappeared somewhere in the night, leaving only the weight of his presence in the hallways, and the lodge itself seemed to sigh, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging my wakefulness. I moved carefully through the room, noticing details I hadn't before. Dusty books lined the shelves haphazardly, some with pages curling and yellowed, others intact but brittle. A dresser drawer stuck slightly as I opened it, revealing folded linens and a small collection of objects, a tarnished silver locket, a faded photograph, and tucked beneath the edge of a thin, scratched notebook, a set of diaries. They were small, leather-bound, each one worn with use, the covers cracked and the corners frayed. I lifted one gently, feeling the texture of the leather under my fingers, and realized I had stumbled onto something personal, something intimate. The first diary belonged to a hiker named Thomas Keene who had stayed at the lodge a few years before. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the handwriting was careful, deliberate. I read slowly, letting each sentence sink in. He described the forest in vivid detail, the smell of wet earth, the sound of distant water, the way the trees seemed to lean closer at night. At first it was comforting, almost poetic, but as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Thomas wrote about shadows moving just beyond sight, shapes at the edge of the clearing that seemed deliberate, patient. He mentioned feeling watched, though he tried to convince himself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks. The entries grew darker. Thomas spoke of hearing faint voices at night, whispers in the hallways, subtle scratches in the wood that seemed to follow him from room to room. He wrote about waking in the middle of the night to find the window open slightly, the snow from early winter now replaced by damp autumn leaves scattered on the floor. He tried to reason it away, attributing the disturbances to animals, wind, or his own exhaustion. But I could feel his fear seep through the pages, a quiet, patient dread that mirrored the sensation I had experienced the night before. I set Thomas's diary down and picked up another belonging to a woman named Lillian Hayes. Her handwriting was smaller, more hurried, almost frantic in places. She described the lodge as charming at first, noting the way the sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting golden lines across the floors. But she, too, wrote of shadows. She mentioned hearing footsteps that didn't belong to anyone she could see, objects slightly moved from one day to the next, and a feeling that she was never truly alone, even in the daylight. What struck me most about Lillian's entries was the pattern she described. Each guest she mentioned, herself included, had explored the forest during the day, hiking along winding trails, returning by evening, and each had vanished without explanation after one night or two. Lillian speculated that the forest itself had a rhythm, a deliberate pattern of observation, and that the lodge acted as a threshold, a place where the forest and the world of humans intersected. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read this. The description matched everything I had sensed since arriving: the quiet, patient presence, the subtle observation, the way the lodge seemed alive and aware. Another diary belonged to a man named Henry Foster. His entries were sparse, almost clinical, but chilling in their calmness. He recorded his hikes, the precise paths he took, the landmarks in the forest. And then suddenly he wrote about noticing anomalies, strange markings on trees, footprints that didn't match any animal, and fleeting glimpses of shapes that disappeared when looked at directly. Henry's last entry was unfinished, cut off mid-sentence. The page ended with a single line: "They are aware, always aware." I closed the diary slowly, letting the words linger in my mind. As I set the diaries aside, I realized that the forest, the lodge, and the disappearances were all connected in a way I couldn't fully understand. The caretaker's warnings now made sense in a way I hadn't appreciated before. He had spoken of incidents, of vanished guests, and now I could see a pattern emerging from the diaries. Every person who came here, who explored too deeply, became part of the lodge's slow, patient rhythm. It was not immediate, not violent, but inevitable. The forest observed, and the lodge served as its anchor. I spent the rest of the morning cross-referencing details between the diaries, trying to see if the pattern held. Each guest mentioned others, some missing, some returned with vague, uneasy recollections. There were dates, locations, and descriptions of the same trails, the same trees, the same shadows. The more I read, the clearer it became that the lodge was a threshold, a space where observation turned into disappearance, where human curiosity and the forest's awareness collided. By afternoon, a dull unease had settled into my chest. I walked to the window and stared at the dense forest beyond, imagining the paths Thomas, Lillian, and Henry had taken, imagining the shadows that had watched them, that perhaps still watched. I could feel the weight of the lodge around me, the way the walls seemed to hold memory, the subtle creak of floorboards responding to my presence. The forest outside was patient, and I understood that it had been patient long before I arrived. I returned to the diaries, flipping through the pages once more, letting the words sink in. Each entry added to the sense of inevitability, a slow, creeping dread that filled my mind with questions I could not answer. What happened to those who vanished? Were they absorbed by the forest, claimed by the lodge, or simply moved into another pattern of observation that I could not perceive? I couldn't know, and the uncertainty pressed against my thoughts with the weight of snow-laden branches. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing and through the windows of the lodge. I could hear the wind picking up outside, moving the branches and rustling the leaves, creating faint, deliberate noises that seemed almost like whispers in the halls. I felt a subtle awareness, a sense that I was being watched again, not directly, not violently, but patiently, like the lodge itself was noting my movements, measuring my reactions. I set the diaries aside and moved through the room slowly, touching surfaces to remind myself that I was grounded in reality. The wood of the dresser, the cold metal of the window latch, the brittle fabric of the curtains, they were all real, tangible. But even with that grounding, I could feel the forest and the lodge pressing subtly against my perception, drawing me into a rhythm I did not fully understand. The diaries had revealed a pattern, and now I was part of it, observed as those before me had been. As night fully fell, the shadows in the lodge deepened, stretching along the walls and across the floors. I could hear distant creaks and groans from the upper floors, faint but deliberate. I imagined the guests who had vanished, moving through those hallways, their presence lingering in the dust, the air, the wood. The forest beyond remained dark, patient, and watchful, and I understood that my awareness had consequences. By reading the diaries, by noticing the patterns, I had entered the lodge's rhythm. I sat on the edge of the bed, lantern beside me, and allowed myself to reflect. The forest, the lodge, the vanished hikers, they were all part of a slow, quiet system of observation. The diaries were not just records of disappearance. They were evidence of presence, a lingering awareness that persisted across time. And I realized that I could not fully separate myself from that pattern now. I had read too much, seen too much, and the forest would note it. I closed my eyes briefly, listening to the creaks of the lodge and the subtle whisper of wind outside. I imagined the paths I might walk, the corners of the lodge I might explore, and the shadows that might follow me. There was no immediate threat, no sudden danger, only the patient, inevitable awareness that seemed to permeate everything. The diaries had shown me the pattern, and I now understood that awareness itself carried weight, that noticing could tie me to the lodge and its history in ways I could not undo. And so I remained, quiet, attentive, letting the slow, deliberate rhythm of the lodge and the forest settle over me. The diaries had spoken and I had listened. The pattern was clear. The forest observed, the lodge anchored it, and I was part of that observation now, patient and quiet, waiting for the next subtle shift, the next deliberate shadow, the next whisper in the halls. I had been wandering the lodge all morning, moving slowly from room to room, touching the worn wood, tracing the faded wallpaper, listening to the subtle creaks of the building as if it were trying to speak. The diaries I had found the day before had filled my mind with a patient unease, and now, even in daylight, the shadows seemed heavier, lingering longer than natural. Each room held a faint memory, the residue of people who had come and gone, and I felt their presence pressing gently, insistently against the edges of perception. It was in the far corner of the east wing, under a loose floorboard in what had once been a small sitting room, that I noticed something different. The wood was slightly warped, uneven beneath my weight, and a faint draft seemed to seep from beneath it. At first, I thought it was just decay, the result of years of neglect and moisture, but the more I pressed my ear to the board, the more I realized it was not empty space below. There was a subtle hum, almost imperceptible, like air moving through a small, enclosed chamber. I knelt down, running my fingers over the edges of the board, feeling the rough grain of the wood. It shifted slightly under my touch, reluctant, as if resisting my attention. My heart began to beat a little faster, though not in fear exactly, more in anticipation. I had read about hidden crawl spaces in old lodges before, but the way this one felt, it was different. It was deliberate, intentional, like the lodge had been built to hide something, to preserve it, and now it was inviting me to notice. I carefully lifted the board, the creak of hinges beneath the floorboards echoing softly in the quiet room. The space beneath was shallow, just enough to crawl into, but there was a faint, stale smell, like dust and old wood, mixed with something I could not name. I leaned in, peering into the darkness, and saw the faint outline of a small door set into the wall of the crawlspace itself. It was made of heavy wood, darkened by age and sealed with a simple iron latch. The door seemed to hum slightly, a vibration that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. I paused, letting my mind settle. The caretaker's warnings, the vanished hikers, the diaries, they all came back to me in a rush of understanding. This lodge, this forest, had a rhythm. Observation led to disappearance. Curiosity led to exposure, and perhaps this hidden room beneath the floorboards was a center of it, a place where past events had left their mark, where the echoes of crimes long unsolved lingered like ghosts in the wood. With a slow, deliberate motion, I lifted the latch. The iron was cold beneath my fingers, resisting just enough to remind me that this was not an ordinary space. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, and the room seemed to exhale, a faint, almost imperceptible shift of air that carried the weight of years of secrets carefully preserved. I climbed in slowly, my hands brushing against the rough wood walls, feeling the texture, the age, the presence of something waiting quietly in the shadows. The room was small, barely enough to sit or crouch comfortably. The floor beneath was uneven, and the air was thick with dust, dry and ancient, carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine. But it was not empty. In one corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of rotting cloth, I could see fragments of paper, journals, perhaps records. I moved closer, brushing aside the debris, and found pages yellowed and brittle, the handwriting faint but deliberate. I realized immediately that these were the records of guests long gone, some mentioned in the diaries, others forgot entirely. I settled into the space, letting the dust settle around me, and began reading. The first entry was a guest named Richard Harlow, who had stayed at the lodge decades ago. His handwriting was careful, methodical, and his words described the forest and the lodge with a familiarity that was both comforting and unnerving. But the tone shifted quickly, revealing a growing unease. Richard wrote of shadows that moved just beyond sight, whispers that seemed to follow him from room to room, and objects that appeared to shift slightly when he wasn't looking. The more I read, the more I felt the echoes of his presence in the room, the weight of his awareness lingering in the air. Another journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor Briggs. Her entries were more personal, almost like confessions, detailing her fear of being watched, her attempts to make sense of the strange occurrences, and the way the forest seemed to claim small pieces of her attention. She described wandering into the lodge's hallways late at night, seeing fleeting shapes at the corners of her vision, and feeling a presence that was patient, deliberate, and unyielding. Her last entry ended abruptly. "I think the lodge knows me. I think it will remember me forever." I closed the page slowly, letting the words sink in. I realized that this hidden room was a repository of memory, a place where the lodge preserved not objects, but experiences, emotions, observations. Each journal, each entry, was a trace of someone who had come to the lodge, who had noticed, and who had been marked in some subtle way. The room beneath the floorboards held the echoes of the past like a living organism, patient and quiet, waiting for the next observer to add their own imprint. I sat back, listening to the faint creak of the lodge above, the wind moving through broken windows, and the subtle sounds of the forest pressing against the outer walls. The air was thick with anticipation, not hostile, not violent, but deliberate. I felt the presence of those who had come before, their awareness lingering like smoke in the air, intertwining with my own. It was a slow, patient tension, the kind that settles into your mind and refuses to leave. I began to notice patterns in the journals. Guests described the same trails in the forest, the same anomalies in the lodge, the same fleeting glimpses of shapes that could not be fully seen. Each disappearance was preceded by observation, by subtle hints, by patient attention from the forest and the building itself. It was not immediate, not aggressive, but inevitable. The lodge, the forest, and I were all part of a slow, deliberate system of awareness. Hours passed as I read, each entry adding to the sense of quiet dread. I could feel my own movements being noted, my own presence becoming part of the rhythm. The journals recorded the past, but they also resonated with the present. I understood with a strange clarity that by entering this room, by observing, I was participating in the lodge's slow cycle. Awareness carried consequence, and I had crossed the threshold without fully realizing it. The shadows in the crawlspace seemed to lengthen, subtle and patient, stretching along the walls, shifting with the movement of the lantern light. I could hear faint creaks from above, the building settling in response to my presence, the rhythm of the lodge intertwining with my own heartbeat. There was no sudden danger, only the quiet weight of history, deliberate and unhurried. The hidden room beneath the floorboards was more than a space. It was a repository of attention, a witness to everything that had happened, and I was now part of its awareness. I leaned back, letting the journals rest beside me, and tried to calm my thoughts. The air was thick, stale, but not suffocating. The lodge itself seemed to exhale, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the subtle hum in the walls. I could feel the echoes of past crimes, not violent in the conventional sense, but lingering, patient, waiting for the next observer to acknowledge them. The forest outside pressed in softly, the wind whispering through the trees, carrying the quiet insistence of observation. I thought of the caretaker, his warnings, his reluctance to speak. He had known this room existed. He had known the pattern, and he had chosen to share just enough to keep me aware, to prepare me, without fully explaining the consequences. I realized now that awareness itself was the point. The lodge and the forest observed patiently, and by noticing I had entered their cycle. Night approached, and the forest beyond the lodge grew darker, the shadows stretching long and thin. Pressing closer to the windows, I listened to the subtle noises above me, the creaks and groans of the building settling, and the faint rustle of branches outside. The room beneath the floorboards felt alive, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense of preserved memory, of echoes that could not be erased. I was a participant now, my presence noted, my awareness recorded in the rhythm of the lodge. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the dust settle, the air still and heavy around me. The hidden room had revealed itself, not as a source of immediate horror, but as a slow, deliberate presence, patient and unyielding. The echoes of crimes long unsolved, the memories of vanished guests, and the patient observation of the forest all converged here, beneath the floorboards. I understood fully that I could not leave untouched. I had entered a space of history, of attention, of quiet dread, and it would carry me forward gently, inevitably into the night. The road narrowed as I drove closer to Raven Creek, the tires crunching over damp gravel that had been slicked by the morning fog. The mist rolled in thick banks, curling through the trees and curling around the edges of the road, softening the shapes of everything it touched. At first, it was comforting, almost dreamlike, as if the forest itself were wrapping me in a quiet blanket, hiding me from the harshness of the world. But as I continued, the fog thickened, and I began to notice sounds beneath it, soft, faint, almost drowned out by the gentle trickle of water. I slowed the car, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out the creek itself. The water moved quietly, dark and steady, reflecting the muted light in uneven lines. Every so often, I thought I heard something different in the fog, a faint murmur, the subtle shift of a branch, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the water. I told myself it was imagination, nerves, the way isolation plays tricks on the mind. But still, I felt a tightness in my chest, an awareness that there was something here I couldn't name. The cabin appeared gradually, a shadowed shape emerging through the mist. Its roof was dark, streaked with moss, and the walls, though solid, were dulled by years of rain and neglect. A thin plume of smoke curled from the chimney, though I could not see the source. The windows were clouded with grime, reflecting the gray light of the morning, and the front porch sagged slightly, as if weighed down by the weight of the forest itself. I parked a few steps from the cabin, the fog curling around my boots as I stepped out. The smell of wet pine and damp earth filled the air, rich and dense. I drew a slow breath, letting it settle in my lungs, trying to steady the slight tremor in my hands. The water from the creek whispered nearby, flowing softly over rocks, hiding the faint echoes of something I could not place. A chill ran along my spine, subtle, patient, a quiet warning. The fog moved in and out between the trees, brushing against the cabin like fingertips, hiding and revealing shapes, hinting at the presence of something just beyond vision. I approached the front porch slowly, each step deliberate. The boards creaked softly beneath my weight, protesting or perhaps just announcing my arrival. The door was solid, made of dark wood, and the handle was cold beneath my fingers. I turned it slowly, half expecting it to resist, half expecting something to react. The door opened with a soft groan, and I stepped inside, letting the muffled sound of the creak fade behind me. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke, a combination that was at once comforting and unsettling. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by the occasional animal prints that trailed through the corners. I ran my fingers over the edge of a wooden table, noticing the rough texture, the small scratches and gouges left by years of use. The cabin felt alive in a peculiar way, as if it remembered every footstep, every sound, every presence that had passed through its walls. I moved carefully, exploring slowly. A fireplace stood cold and empty, blackened by old fires. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of what looked like herbs, faded photographs, and stacks of folded linens. The air was quiet, but I could feel it pressing against me, a subtle weight that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Every so often I caught movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow shifting, a faint bend of mist through the window, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. Drawn toward the window overlooking the creek, I pressed my hands against the cold glass. The fog swirled thickly outside, curling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, moving as if something within it was guiding it. The creek itself whispered constantly, a gentle, soothing sound, masking faint noises that I could not immediately identify. For a moment I thought I heard a cry, high and thin, almost like a child calling or a person in distress. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound faded, swallowed by the fog and the steady murmur of water. I sat on the edge of a chair, lantern light casting long, shifting shadows across the cabin. The quiet was almost oppressive, but not in a sharp, startling way. It was slow, patient, lingering, pressing against my awareness. I tried to remind myself that isolation amplifies perception, that the mind notices patterns that do not exist, that the fog and the water and the dim light could create illusions where there were none. Still, the feeling persisted. Someone or something was here, moving just beyond the edge of observation, patient, deliberate. I walked to the corner of the room where a small pile of papers had been left. They were journals, handwritten and faded, the ink smudged in places by dampness. I picked one up, brushing off the dust, and opened it carefully. The handwriting was small and careful, documenting hikes along the creek, the shape of the forest, the subtle patterns in the mist. The writer described the fog itself as alive, moving in ways that suggested awareness, brushing against the skin, whispering secrets that could not be fully understood. The more I read, the more I felt the truth in those words. The journals told of visitors who had disappeared along the creek, people who had ventured into the fog and never returned. They spoke of faint cries, of strange shapes glimpsed just beyond sight, of footsteps that echoed when no one was there. Some entries ended abruptly, the final lines filled with fear and confusion, leaving spaces that felt deliberate, like a pause in a conversation that had been interrupted. As I read, I felt the air in the cabin grow heavier, the shadows deepen, and the whisper of the creek outside more insistent. I put down the journal and moved toward the door at the back of the cabin, drawn by curiosity I could not resist. The door led to a small back porch, where the fog pressed thickly against the rails. I could barely see the edge of the creek through the mist, but I sensed its flow, steady and unyielding, carrying whispers and echoes with it. I imagined the people who had vanished here, their paths swallowed by fog, leaving nothing but memory and anticipation behind. The forest watched patiently. The water carried away traces of presence, and the cabin preserved the faint resonance of events that had occurred within its walls. A sudden movement at the edge of the fog caught my attention, subtle and deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, trying to make sense of the shape that seemed to linger just beyond the creek. It could have been a tree, a branch, or the trick of light on water, but the movement felt too deliberate, too intentional, like awareness in the fog itself. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with the slow realization that this place was not passive. It was attentive, patient, waiting for those who noticed, those who listened, those who acknowledged its presence. I returned to the cabin, letting the lantern light guide me. The journals lay on the table, their words pressing against my consciousness, filling my thoughts with slow, creeping unease. Every sound, the drip of water, the creak of boards, the distant whisper of wind, felt like part of a rhythm I was just beginning to understand. The fog outside was no longer comforting. It was deliberate, patient, moving in patterns that suggested intent. The creek whispered continuously, masking faint, indistinct cries, carrying them along its path, leaving them suspended between perception and reality. I sat back in the chair, letting my hands rest on my knees, trying to steady my thoughts. The journal entries, the whispers of the creek, the deliberate movement in the fog, all of it created a slow, patient dread, subtle but insistent. I realized that this cabin, this creek, this fog, had a history far older than any single guest. The disappearances, the journals, the warnings, they were all threads in a pattern, a rhythm of observation and consequence that stretched far beyond my understanding. Night began to fall and the fog grew thicker, curling through the trees, enveloping the creek, pressing against the cabin. I lit a small lantern and let the light dance across the walls, across the journals, across the floorboards. The sound of the creek was constant, a low, hypnotic whisper, masking other noises that might have revealed themselves if I listened closely. I felt the weight of the forest pressing in, patient, deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to arrive, for me to notice, for me to acknowledge its rhythm. I opened the journal one last time, tracing the faint lines of ink with my fingers. The words spoke of observation, of patience, of the inevitable pull of the forest and the creek. The fog outside was no longer just a mist. It was a presence, alive in its subtlety, aware in its quiet persistence. The water whispered continuously, carrying away traces, preserving nothing, yet hinting at everything. I understood slowly that by noticing, by reading, by being here, I had entered the rhythm of Raven Creek, and it would not let me leave untouched. I let the lantern light fade into the dim glow of twilight, listening to the steady whisper of the creek and the subtle movement of the fog. The cabin held its breath, the forest pressed close, and I felt the patient, inevitable awareness of this place settle over me. Here, at the edge of Raven Creek, enveloped in fog and shadow, I understood the quiet truth. Some places remember, some waters carry echoes, and some forests watch patiently, always for those who notice. Night fell over Raven Creek with a quiet inevitability, as if the forest itself had been waiting for the sun to dip below the trees. The fog lingered thickly, settling around the cabin like a living veil, curling through the gaps in the floorboards and creeping along the rails of the porch. I lit a small lantern, its soft glow brushing across the walls and furniture, and stepped outside, feeling the cold, damp air settle against my skin. The creek whispered nearby, the water's slow, steady flow carrying the faintest hints of voices or cries I could not place. I moved slowly along the path beside the cabin, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. Each step was deliberate, careful, as though the ground itself were listening. The fog clung to the trees and bushes, wrapping them in layers of gray, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. At first, the sounds I noticed were subtle. The soft rustle of leaves, the occasional creak of a branch, the low murmur of the creek against the bank. I told myself these were ordinary forest noises, nothing more, but a quiet tension had settled in my chest that I could not shake. I stopped for a moment, listening. There it was, a faint footstep, soft, deliberate, somewhere behind me. Not close, not immediate, but distinct enough to make my pulse quicken. I turned slowly, squinting through the fog, but saw nothing. The trees loomed as shadows, their trunks dark and immovable, yet I felt eyes on me, a subtle awareness that lingered beyond vision. I took a careful step forward, and the footstep echoed again, matching the rhythm of my own, though always just behind, never catching up, never revealing its source. The forest was patient. I could feel it around me in the damp smell of earth and moss, in the way the fog twisted between the trees, in the gentle murmur of the creek. The footsteps did not startle me. They did not need to. They were slow, persistent, subtle. The kind of presence that presses against your mind rather than your body, the kind that makes you aware of every movement, every breath, every shift in the shadows. I walked along the narrow path, lantern in hand, aware of the faint echoes that mirrored me but never fully revealed themselves. I tried to ground myself in reason. The forest was full of small animals, birds, perhaps even other hikers who had wandered off the path. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind, primed by the journals and the stories of vanished guests, was playing tricks on me. But the sound was too deliberate, too consistent. It matched my steps too perfectly, paused when I paused, shifted when I shifted. I could feel the presence of something aware, something patient, hidden just beyond sight. I moved closer to the creek, the water flowing steadily beside me. The fog rolled in slow waves over the bank, hiding the ripples and eddies from view. And then I heard it again. Not a footstep this time, but a faint rustle like someone brushing against leaves, careful, deliberate, making no sudden movement, no abrupt noise. My chest tightened slightly, not with fear exactly, but with awareness. I was being observed. I had crossed the boundary between ordinary forest and something more deliberate, and the forest knew I was here. I stopped completely, letting the lantern light fall across the mist. The sound shifted slightly, subtle, patient, deliberate. There was no aggression, no rush, only a slow awareness, a quiet insistence. I imagined whoever or whatever was moving through the fog, tracing my path, nodding my presence. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another hiker? Could it be an animal? Or could it be something I had read about in the journals? The presence that seemed to mark each visitor to the lodge and the creek, watching patiently, allowing them to wander, observing until they became part of its rhythm. The fog thickened as I continued along the creek, curling around my legs, clinging to my sleeves, pressing against my hair and face. Every sound became more pronounced, yet more subtle at the same time. A twig snapped softly beneath the fog, the sound immediate and distant all at once. I paused again, listening, and the echo returned in the form of a distant rustle, a shadowy movement among the trees, something patient and deliberate that matched the rhythm of the forest and the creek. I felt the pull of it, the careful insistence that made me aware of my own presence in this quiet, ancient place. I remembered the journals from the cabin, the accounts of visitors who had wandered the forest, who had heard sounds in the fog, who had felt shadows moving in tandem with their own steps. The authors had described the forest as attentive, patient, aware, and I now understood what they meant. It was not supernatural in the way of sudden apparitions or shrieks. It was subtle, deliberate, the kind of attention that infiltrates your senses without announcing itself. Every movement, every glance, every step was noted, absorbed, remembered. I continued walking, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, letting my ears attune to the subtle rhythm of the forest. The creek whispered, the fog shifted, and the footsteps persisted, always just behind me, never revealing, never confronting. I felt a strange mixture of caution and curiosity, a desire to understand, to trace the pattern, even as my mind reminded me to stay wary. The forest was patient, and I was now part of its careful observation. At one point, I paused on a small bridge that crossed a particularly narrow section of the creek. The water below gurgled gently, carrying away small leaves and twigs, hiding them in its flow. I leaned against the railing, peering into the fog, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw movement on the far bank. A shadow, slender and deliberate, flicked between two trees, then vanished. My heart skipped, and I told myself it was nothing, just the trick of fog and light. Yet the subtle feeling persisted. I was not alone, and the forest had been waiting for me to notice. I moved off the bridge slowly, keeping the lantern low, shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. The footsteps continued, never approaching directly, never revealing themselves. I realized that I was now in a dialogue with the forest, a careful, patient exchange. I moved, it responded. I paused, it noted. The creek whispered beneath it all, carrying away traces, preserving silence, leaving only the weight of observation behind. I reached a small clearing where the fog thinned slightly, the moonlight piercing in faint, silver shafts. The shadows shifted across the ground, long and patient. I could hear the subtle crunch of leaves, the faint rustle of underbrush, and the whisper of the creek as it wound through the trees. The presence behind me remained, patient and deliberate, observing without confrontation. I felt my own heartbeat, steady and deliberate, and I realized that awareness itself had become a shared rhythm, my mind entwined with the forest's quiet insistence. I stopped in the clearing and let my lantern light fall across the trees. I listened carefully, noting every subtle shift in sound, every delicate movement in the fog. It was then that I understood fully what the journals had meant. The forest observed patiently, attentively. Those who noticed were marked, but not immediately, not violently. The attention was slow, deliberate, and persistent. I was aware now, fully, and by being aware, I had entered its rhythm. Hours seemed to pass in this quiet, patient exchange. I moved slowly back toward the cabin, lantern swinging gently, the fog curling around my legs, following my path. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadow, every echo in the mist reminded me that I was being observed, but not threatened, at least not yet. The footsteps behind me had become part of the rhythm, an echo that responded to my own presence, a subtle mark of attention from the forest that stretched back through time and memory. By the time I returned to the cabin, the fog had thickened once more, swallowing the creek and the trees, hiding everything beyond a few feet. I stepped onto the porch, letting the lantern light fall across the weathered boards. The footsteps had stopped, fading into silence, but the awareness lingered, patient and deliberate, pressing softly against my mind. I entered the cabin slowly, letting the door click shut behind me, and felt the subtle exhale of the forest outside. I sat near the window, watching the fog move across the creek, listening to the gentle whisper of water and wind. The night had taught me something I could not unlearn. The forest observed, the fog carried attention, the creek remembered, and I was now a participant in its patient rhythm, marked not by violence but by awareness, by the subtle, creeping dread of being seen without ever fully being confronted. I understood the meaning of the footsteps, the rustles, the echoes. They were a quiet presence, a reminder that the forest and the creek and the fog remembered everything, patiently, deliberately, for as long as anyone noticed. I had spent the morning inside the cabin, the fog pressing softly against the windows, filtering the light into dull, muted patterns across the floorboards. The journals I had discovered along the creek earlier lay scattered on the table, pages open, filled with the careful handwriting of those who had vanished before me. I had read them over and over, tracing the patterns, the roots, the subtle hints that something in the forest always watched, always remembered. And yet there was one detail I could not shake, an entry, brief and almost hidden, that spoke of a grave near the cabin, long forgotten, overgrown with weeds and moss, as though nature itself tried to erase it from memory. Curiosity gnawed at me, patient and insistent until I could no longer resist. I packed a small bag with gloves, a trowel, and a flashlight. I tried to steady my mind, reminding myself that I was careful, deliberate, aware of my surroundings. Yet even as I stepped out onto the porch, the fog curling around my boots and the chill pressing against my skin, I could not ignore the feeling that the forest was watching, aware of every movement, every intention. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin, where the fog thinned slightly but did not dissipate. The forest pressed close on both sides, trees standing like silent sentinels, their trunks dark and immovable. The creek's whisper faded behind me, replaced by the subtle rustle of leaves, the occasional groan of branches shifting in the wind, and something else, an almost imperceptible murmur, like a voice carried briefly and then swallowed by the fog. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of imagination, but I could feel the patient awareness of the place, subtle and unrelenting. After some careful searching, I found it, a depression in the earth, nearly hidden beneath a tangle of roots and moss. The ground had been disturbed long ago, the soil darker and softer than its surroundings. I knelt, brushing away the leaves, and felt the weight of the years pressing against me. This was it, the forgotten grave, a shallow resting place, patient and hidden, marking the presence of someone who had vanished decades ago, leaving nothing behind but memory and subtle traces in the earth. I worked slowly, careful not to disturb too much at once. The soil was damp, heavy with years of decomposition, and the faint smell of earth mixed with something I could not name, something that carried the weight of absence, of loss, of stories left unfinished. My hands were steady, deliberate, though a tight knot of unease had settled in my stomach. I imagined the campers who had disappeared, young and full of life, their laughter and voices now only faint echoes in the journals and in the patient silence of the forest. As I cleared more of the ground, I noticed fragments of objects, small and worn. A metal buckle, a piece of cloth, perhaps a tag from a backpack. Each item was a tiny testament, a subtle mark of life that had once been here, now quiet and still beneath the soil. I traced the edges with my fingers, careful not to displace them more than necessary, aware that every movement was part of the slow narrative this place preserved. The forest, the creek, the fog, they observed patiently, noting my actions, recording my presence as another layer in the ongoing rhythm. I paused to listen, the air around me thick with stillness, the fog curling in gentle waves through the trees. The whisper of the creek returned, faint and distant, carrying the soft murmur of water over rocks and fallen branches. And then I heard it, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound like a shuffle, a soft scrape, distant but deliberate, as though someone or something had moved just beyond the edge of the fog. My chest tightened slightly, a mix of anticipation and caution. I had crossed the boundary into the rhythm of the forest, where awareness itself carried weight. I continued to uncover the grave slowly, letting my hands brush the soil gently. The deeper I went, the more I felt the presence of those who had come before, patient echoes settling in the air, attentive and deliberate. I thought about the campers, their journals, their roots, the subtle hints of observation that had marked their time in the forest. They had vanished quietly without immediate violence, but the forest had noticed, and it remembered. I realized, with a quiet, insistent clarity, that by uncovering this grave, I had become part of that memory, an observer acknowledged by something patient and unhurried. The objects in the grave became clearer, a fragment of a worn notebook, yellowed with age, a small broken compass, a tarnished belt buckle. Each was a quiet testament to the life that had once moved through this forest, now preserved in absence. I felt the weight of history pressing softly against my shoulders, the patient insistence of the forest and creek and fog, observing, recording, remembering. It was not hostile, but it was deliberate. Awareness here carried consequence, subtle and enduring. I crouched over the grave, brushing my hands through the soil, and imagined the lives that had ended here. I thought of their laughter and conversations, their footsteps along the creek, the way they had paused to notice small details, unaware that the forest had already begun to mark them. I felt the quiet tension of the present pressing against me, patient, unhurried, and I understood that I was now part of a long line of observers, participants in the rhythm of memory and attention that defined this place. A sudden breeze stirred the fog, curling around my shoulders, carrying with it the faintest rustle of leaves and underbrush. I paused, listening carefully. The forest seemed to shift subtly, shadows lengthening, the fog pressing closer, patient, deliberate. I told myself it was just the wind, the natural rhythm of the night, yet I could feel a quiet awareness in the movement, a sense that the forest noted my presence and actions with patient precision. Every step I had taken, every movement of my hands, every inhalation and exhalation, it was all registered in the quiet rhythm that surrounded me. I set down the trowel and let my hands rest on the soil, feeling the weight of the years beneath me. The creek's whisper carried softly, distant but steady, masking the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of movement beyond the fog. I imagined the campers' footsteps, fading in the distance, absorbed by the patient, deliberate attention of the forest. Their voices were gone, their bodies hidden, but their presence remained, etched into the soil, preserved in quiet layers of memory. I was now part of that memory, a witness acknowledged, observed, and recorded. Time seemed to stretch as I lingered, crouched beside the grave, letting the subtle rhythm of the forest and creek and fog settle around me. The objects, the soil, the faint, lingering smells, They spoke of life interrupted, of attention preserved, of quiet, patient observation. I felt a strange mixture of reverence and unease, a slow, deliberate tension that seeped into my bones. There was no sudden shock, no immediate danger, only the enduring, subtle weight of memory and awareness pressing softly against my mind. I carefully replaced the leaves over the grave, letting the soil fall gently into place, restoring the subtle concealment that nature had attempted to preserve. The objects remained in situ, their presence quiet but deliberate, like whispers of life preserved in the attentive silence of the forest. I stood slowly, brushing the damp soil from my hands, and felt the weight of the forest pressing softly, reminding me that observation here was patient, deliberate, and enduring. As I walked back toward the cabin, the fog curling around my boots and legs, I felt the quiet presence of the forgotten grave following me, not physically, but as an echo in the rhythm of awareness. The creek whispered softly beside me, carrying away traces, preserving silence, leaving only the subtle impression of observation. I understood that the campers' stories, their journals, their vanished bodies, they were all part of a larger narrative, a slow, deliberate record kept by the forest, attentive and patient, always waiting for the next observer to notice. Back at the cabin, I paused at the porch, letting the lantern light fall across the weathered boards. The fog pressed close, curling against the cabin walls, masking the forest beyond. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the subtle murmur of underbrush, the whisper of water flowing over rocks. The forgotten grave lay behind me, quiet, patient, deliberate. I had seen it, acknowledged it, and in doing so had become part of the rhythm of observation that had marked this place for decades. I entered the cabin slowly, the door closing softly behind me. The fog outside shifted in waves, curling around the walls and windows, patient and deliberate. I felt the weight of the forest pressing against the edges of awareness, subtle but insistent. The forgotten grave remained, preserved in quiet layers of soil and memory, carrying the echoes of vanished campers, their footsteps absorbed by the attentive rhythm of the creek and the forest. And I, now a witness, understood fully that this place remembered, observed, and waited patiently for every observer who came to notice. The moon hung low over Raven Creek, spilling pale silver light across the water and the mist that still clung stubbornly to the trees. I stepped outside, the air cold and damp, pressing against my skin, curling in tendrils that brushed my face like invisible fingers. Lanterns were unnecessary now. The moonlight was enough to trace shapes, reveal the gentle ripple of the creek, and yet in the same glance obscure them completely. Shadows stretched long and thin, reaching across the water, twisting with the wind, and I felt the slow, creeping uncertainty settle over me. I walked along the bank, barefoot this time, letting the wet earth cool my feet. The creek's surface was glassy in some stretches, reflecting the moon in fractured patterns, broken by occasional eddies and tiny waves. At first it was soothing, the quiet murmur of water, the soft, rhythmic brush of wind through the pines. And then I noticed the shadows, long, shifting, slithering across the surface as if the water itself had a life of its own. I paused, leaning over the edge, trying to distinguish reflection from reality, light from shape, imagination from truth. The fog hugged the creek in low banks, curling through tree roots, slipping silently over rocks, masking what lay beneath. I imagined shapes moving just below the surface, limbs tangled in reeds, faces pressed against water, or perhaps only reflections of the trees, distorted by wind and current. The creek whispered constantly, carrying hints of sound, soft murmurs I couldn't place. For a moment I thought I heard someone calling my name, distant, hesitant, almost swallowed by the movement of the water and the wind. I told myself it was the creek, the fog, the forest playing tricks, but the knot in my chest tightened with deliberate awareness. I took a careful step closer to the water's edge, the ground soft beneath my boots, and noticed the way the moonlight reflected in small pools along the bank. Shadows and water reflections danced together, weaving illusions that seemed deliberate, as if the creek itself had become a mirror for unseen presences. Each ripple, each glint of light, carried a suggestion of movement, a hint of something watching, following, lingering just beyond my vision. I found myself squinting, shifting my perspective, trying to separate the natural from the deliberate, the real from the imagined. I knelt beside a small eddy where the water swirled slowly around a half-submerged log. The reflection there was distorted, fragmented by current and moonlight, yet I could have sworn I saw a face, brief, fleeting, then gone, smiling, crying, or perhaps only imagined. I traced the movement with my eyes, watching the water carry patterns downstream, and the shadow followed in quiet synchrony, patient, deliberate. It was impossible to know what was real, and yet I could feel the awareness pressing in, subtle, slow, deliberate, a patient insistence that this place noticed everything. The journals I had read earlier flashed in my memory, the entries describing vanished campers, the quiet attention of the forest, the creek that seemed to preserve memory and whisper in a way that only the observant could hear. I felt the same weight now, a delicate, pressing awareness that made me question every reflection, every shadow, every ripple in the water. The creek was more than a body of water. It was a repository, a patient witness, a mirror for both reality and imagination. And I was part of its rhythm now, marked by observation, remembered by its quiet insistence. I rose to my feet, letting the cool mist drift over my arms and neck. The shadows along the creek shifted slowly, moving with the wind, with the water, with the rhythm of my own presence. At one moment I thought I glimpsed movement just beyond the trees, a figure, slender, patient, observing from the edge of moonlight and fog. When I blinked, it was gone. My heart beat steadily, but my mind churned, trying to reconcile what I had seen with what the forest allowed me to see. The ambiguity itself was oppressive, deliberate. I could not know, yet I felt the weight of what might be true pressing gently but insistently against my awareness. I moved along the creek slowly, listening to the water, letting the faint rustle of leaves and occasional snapping of twigs guide me. Every sound became amplified by expectation, by history, by memory. The moonlight reflected in pools along the bank, and in each I imagined shapes, shadows that lingered longer than they should, reflections that seemed to move independently, subtle forms that suggested life where none existed. I found that the more I searched, the more I questioned my own perception. The forest, the creek, the fog, they were patient teachers, reminding me that not all truth could be grasped, that some observations were meant only to unsettle, to suggest, to linger in the mind. I crouched near a fallen branch that jutted into the water, brushing my fingers over the moss and wet wood. The reflection of the moon on the creek was fractured there, bending the shadows of surrounding trees into strange, almost human forms. I imagined campers I had read about, long gone, their figures moving silently through the fog, their voices carried faintly in the whisper of water. The creek had witnessed everything and remembered quietly, deliberately, preserving the rhythm of memory while hiding the definitive truth beneath the surface. A subtle sound behind me made me freeze, a soft, careful step, or perhaps the scrape of branches against one another. My pulse quickened, though not violently, only enough to make me aware of the patient attention around me. I turned slowly, squinting through the fog, but saw nothing. The shadowed edges of the trees seemed to move subtly, patient, deliberate, almost as if aware of my observation. I stepped forward and the sound moved with me, a quiet echo, patient, deliberate. I realized that in this place, perception itself was the bridge between reality and ambiguity. The creek and the forest and the fog blurred all boundaries. I knelt again at the water's edge, letting the lantern light I had brought earlier fall softly over the surface, though the moonlight still dominated. The reflection was broken and shifting, impossible to pin down. Shadows overlapped, water rippled, fog curled, and I could no longer trust my own senses. Yet the ambiguity was not hostile. It was instructive, a slow, careful reminder that the forest, the creek, the fog, and the shadows observed everything, remembered everything, and allowed only what was necessary to be seen. Time passed with no clear measure. The creek's whispers became a rhythm, the moonlight a steady, fractured illumination, the fog a shifting curtain. Shadows danced at the edge of perception, sometimes alone, sometimes suggesting forms just beyond clarity. I felt myself drawn into the ambiguity, recognizing that clarity might never come, that the forest and the creek preserved only suggestion, only observation, only the patient presence of memory and awareness. I began to move along the bank again, careful and deliberate, aware that the reflection of my own steps might be mirrored, followed, or recorded by this quiet rhythm. I paused near a small pool where the moonlight struck directly, silvering the surface into a flat, perfect mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw movement beneath the surface, a shadow that seemed to mimic mine exactly, yet shifted independently, subtle and deliberate. I held my breath, watching, wondering, questioning my own perception. The creek whispered beneath the log and rocks, carrying small sounds that might have been branches, animals, or perhaps something else entirely. I realized that the forest and the creek did not need to act violently. Ambiguity was enough. Awareness alone was power. I returned to the cabin with slow, measured steps, letting the rhythm of the creek guide me. The fog swirled around my legs, curling in patient tendrils, and the shadows followed, stretched and bent under the moonlight. Every reflection, every ripple, every whisper carried suggestion, carrying memory, carrying observation. I understood that the creek held its secrets carefully, that the forest watched patiently, that the fog concealed as much as it revealed. And I was now part of that quiet narrative, a witness to the patient, deliberate ambiguity of Raven Creek. Back at the cabin, I paused on the porch, letting the moonlight fall over the boards. The fog pressed close against the walls, curling in soft waves, masking the creek and trees beyond. The reflections in the water remained uncertain, shifting in rhythm with the wind and current, carrying the echoes of observation, ambiguity, and memory. I leaned against the railing and exhaled slowly, realizing that the creek's truths were layered, patient, deliberate, and that the forest's observation was never urgent, only persistent. I entered the cabin quietly, the door closing softly behind me. Shadows from the moonlight lingered on the walls, stretched by the fog outside, moving subtly, deliberately, patiently. I felt the weight of the creek, the forest, and the fog pressing against the edges of my awareness. The reflections, the whispers, the patient ambiguity, they would remain with me long after I left, a slow, deliberate mark of the forest's rhythm and memory. Here, on the banks of Raven Creek, under the moon's pale light, I understood fully that truth was often less about what could be seen and more about what could be felt, remembered, and observed in patient silence. I first noticed the neighboring cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clearing in muted shades of gold and gray. From my own cabin, I could see it tucked behind a cluster of pines, its outline blurred by distance and the faint haze that always seemed to linger in this part of the forest. At first, it seemed abandoned. No smoke from a chimney, no movement, no sign of life. And yet, something about it made my chest tighten, a subtle unease that whispered beneath my calm exterior. I lit a small lantern and stepped outside, letting the fading light guide me toward the edge of the clearing. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something faintly metallic I could not place. My boots crunched softly against the underbrush, and I tried to focus on the natural rhythm of the forest, the soft murmur of the creek nearby, the occasional call of a bird returning to its roost, the wind shifting gently through the branches. But I could not shake the feeling that the cabin across the clearing was aware of me, that it existed not just as wood and nails, but as a quiet presence, patient and observant. As I drew closer, I noticed the subtle flicker of light from one of its windows. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, like a candle struggling against the evening, and yet there it was, a slow, hesitant glow that pulsed with a rhythm that felt deliberate. I paused mid-step, listening. The forest held its breath alongside me. There was no wind, no animal sound, only the soft murmur of distant water and the muted rustle of leaves. The light flickered again, and I felt the first, delicate prickle of awareness at the base of my neck. Someone or something, might be inside. I approached carefully, keeping to the shadows, letting the trees break my outline. Each step was deliberate, measured, conscious of the sound I made and the way the earth might record it. I could see the cabin more clearly now. Weathered wood darkened by years of rain, windows clouded with age and dirt, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. No smoke, no obvious movement, yet the flicker persisted, slow, subtle, deliberate. I told myself it might be a reflection of the setting sun, a trick of fading light through dirty glass, but my mind would not rest. I circled the cabin slowly, keeping my distance. The forest seemed quieter here, more patient, as if holding its breath for me to decide my next step. The flicker came again, accompanied by a faint shadow shifting across the inside of the window. My heart rate picked up slightly, though my steps remained calm, deliberate. It was impossible to know what I had seen. Perhaps a curtain swaying in the draft, perhaps nothing at all. And yet the impression lingered. Someone or something was aware of my presence, and the cabin responded, almost imperceptibly, to my movement. I moved to the front of the cabin and studied the door. Weathered wood, a rusty handle, a lock that might still hold after years of neglect. No footprints in the dirt suggested recent visitors, yet I could feel a quiet insistence, subtle and deliberate, that this place was not entirely empty. The clearing around it was undisturbed, yet shadows shifted just beyond the tree line, and I imagined forms lingering there, patient, observing, waiting. I told myself it was the forest, the fog, my own mind. But awareness pressed gently, impossible to ignore. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the faint scent of smoke, wood, and damp earth. I inhaled slowly, noticing how the air seemed to thicken around me, how the forest seemed to watch in silence. My mind drifted to stories I had heard of cabins in remote forests, of places that appeared abandoned but concealed the traces of life, or something that imitated life. A faint sound, a creak from the porch boards, made me pause, every nerve alert, though the clearing remained empty. The forest held its patience like a weight pressing softly against my awareness, the rhythm of attention, deliberate and unhurried. I circled the cabin again, keeping low and slow, my eyes tracing the lines of the walls and windows. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing behind the glass of a side window, but when I blinked, it was gone. Only the flickering light remained, pulsing softly, patiently, like a heartbeat of some hidden presence. My mind raced gently, trying to rationalize what I had seen, trying to convince myself it was shadow, reflection, imagination. Yet the sensation lingered, the subtle certainty that the cabin, and whatever it contained, noticed me, and that my presence was acknowledged. The clearing was quiet except for the creek, its gentle murmur carrying through the evening air. I moved toward the back, the lantern in my hand casting a soft glow over the damp earth. Shadows stretched across the ground, shifting with the moonlight, and I felt a delicate tension press at my chest. There was no rush, no sudden threat, only the patient observation that seemed to define this place. Every step I took was mirrored in quiet anticipation, every breath noted in the slow rhythm of the forest. I knelt beside a patch of moss near the cabin's rear wall, letting my fingers brush the ground. The earth was soft, damp, almost alive in its subtle resistance. I imagined the people who might have lived here long ago, or perhaps those who had simply passed through, leaving traces invisible to casual observation. The flicker from the window continued, slow, deliberate, almost as if it were communicating, hinting, acknowledging my presence without revealing the truth. The forest, the clearing, the cabin, they were all part of the same patient rhythm, attentive, deliberate, observing. I stood and moved closer to the front again, pausing to look through a dirty window. Shapes shifted within, furniture darkened by age, a table scarred and worn, the faint outline of a chair. No figure remained, only the flicker of light, the subtle suggestion of presence, the quiet insistence that this place was not entirely empty. My pulse steadied, slow and deliberate, but my mind could not rest. The cabin across the clearing was patient, quiet, deliberate, and I understood that awareness alone carried weight here. As I stepped back into the shadows, I noticed the forest pressing closer, fog curling softly around the clearing, softening the edges of trees and earth. The light flickered once more, faint, hesitant, almost shy, and then dimmed, leaving the cabin in quiet darkness. I exhaled slowly, letting my breath mingle with the cool evening air, aware that the presence had not disappeared. It had merely receded, patient and deliberate, waiting for observation to resume. I returned toward my own cabin, moving slowly, deliberately, aware of the soft crunch of underbrush beneath my boots. The clearing seemed to stretch longer than it should, shadows bending subtly with the moonlight, fog curling in slow waves. The flicker from the cabin across the clearing remained in my mind, patient, deliberate, a subtle mark of observation, a reminder that some presences were quiet, unhurried, and deeply aware of those who ventured too close. When I reached my porch, I paused, looking back across the clearing one final time. The cabin was still, silent, dark except for the faintest hints of shadowed shapes within. My mind wanted to rationalize it, to dismiss the flicker as candlelight, reflection, or imagination. Yet the awareness remained, subtle and deliberate, pressing gently at the edges of thought. The forest had witnessed my approach, the clearing had observed my movements, and the cabin had acknowledged my presence with quiet insistence. I entered my cabin, shutting the door softly behind me. The lantern cast a warm circle of light across the floorboards, and I felt the contrast sharply. The comfort of the known, the warmth of familiar walls, against the patient, deliberate uncertainty of the clearing beyond. I sat near the window, staring out, watching the fog curl and shift, the shadows stretch and bend. The flicker of light, however brief, remained a quiet presence in my memory, a subtle reminder that some cabins were not abandoned, some presences were patient, and some truths were only hinted at through shadow and light. The morning was quiet, heavier than usual, the fog still curling in low tendrils around the clearing. I had barely slept, my mind restless after the lingering flickers from the neighboring cabin the night before. I tried to convince myself it was just imagination, that shadows and fading light could easily fool the eyes, yet a persistent unease had settled in my chest. It was subtle, patient, like the weight of air before a storm, and I felt it press against me as I opened the door to step outside. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The forest breathed quietly around me, each branch and needle dripping with dew. The clearing was empty except for the faint glimmer of my lantern left on the porch and the distant whisper of the creek. And then I noticed the first item. A small bundle lay near the edge of the porch, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. I had no memory of leaving it there. No footprints led to it, not mine, not anyone else. The bundle was carefully placed, deliberate in its position, almost as if someone had taken time to ensure I would notice it at precisely the right moment. I picked it up cautiously, my fingers brushing the paper. Inside were notes, written in neat, deliberate handwriting I did not recognize. The words were simple, benign, even observations of my movements. "You left the lantern by the door," one line read. Another, "The fog is heavy this morning." My stomach twisted with unease. These were not threats, they were not demands. They were records, quiet acknowledgments that someone or something was watching, patient, deliberate, precise. I placed the notes on the table, careful not to spill the bundle's other contents. A small meal, simple bread and dried fruit, wrapped neatly and untouched, lay beside them. The smell was faintly warm, as though prepared recently, though I had not seen anyone come near the cabin. My hands shook slightly as I set it down. I did not feel fear so much as the patient awareness of being observed, recorded, noted in the quiet, deliberate rhythm of an unseen presence. I stepped outside again, scanning the clearing, the edges of the forest, the neighboring cabin. No movement, no figures, only the trees, the fog, and the soft murmur of the creek carrying itself like a whisper into the clearing. And yet the presence was undeniable, subtle but insistent, a patient weight pressing against my perception. I moved closer to the edge of the porch, peering into the shadows, but saw nothing. The forest remained still, holding its patience, watching as I adjusted to this new rhythm. Later that day, more items appeared. Notes tucked between rocks near the creek, small objects left on the porch, things that I could not recall owning or that had gone missing days ago. A rusted key, a chipped cup, a photograph of a campsite I did not recognize. Each was placed carefully, deliberately, as though someone was curating a collection of my experience here, layering observation upon observation. My mind refused to rest. Every glance into the clearing or toward the neighboring cabin carried the subtle tension that someone was watching, waiting, patient in their concealment. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a neighbor had noticed me in the clearing the day before. Perhaps someone in town had prepared these small tokens as a prank. Yet the precision, the timing, the careful acknowledgement of my exact movements, it defied casual explanation. Every object, every note, every meal was deliberate, quiet, and unhurried, and I understood slowly that this was not about fear or intimidation. It was about presence, observation, acknowledgement, the patient awareness of someone whose patience stretched long and whose attention was exacting. At night, the unease deepened. I sat by the lantern, leafing through the notes again, reading phrases that mirrored my own thoughts. You sit near the table reading the notes. The fog curls around your boots. Simple sentences, mundane even, yet impossibly precise. I felt the patient weight of the presence pressing at the edges of my awareness, subtle, deliberate, unhurried. My mind wandered back to the neighboring cabin, to the flickers I had seen, and to the creeping realization that the observer might be closer than I imagined. The meals continued. Breakfasts laid neatly on the porch, lunches tucked under logs by the edge of the clearing. They were never spoiling, never misplaced, never hurried. Whoever or whatever left them observed the rhythms of my day with careful attention, their awareness threading itself into every small motion, every minor choice I made. I began to notice patterns. Notes appearing shortly after I glanced out a window, objects left in locations I would pass moments later, subtle hints that presence and observation were intertwined, patient and deliberate. I began to speak aloud to the presence, a quiet, tentative acknowledgement of what I felt. "I see you," I whispered to the empty air one morning, and felt a subtle shift in the rhythm of the forest around me. The fog seemed to curl closer, brushing my arms, whispering in its gentle way, patient and deliberate. I imagined eyes tracking me from the neighboring cabin, from the shadows beyond the clearing, from places I could not yet see. The act of speaking, of recognition, felt necessary, as though acknowledgement was the bridge between observation and reality, between my perception and the deliberate rhythm of the presence. Despite the calm, I felt an underlying tension settle deeper in my chest. I moved slowly now, carefully noting the placement of each new item, reading every note, studying every subtle shift in shadow or light. The observer did not hurry, did not rush, did not demand. But the attention was absolute, patient, and deliberate, pressing softly into the quiet corners of my awareness, a constant companion in the rhythm of daily life here. I could not ignore it, could not forget it, and yet I could not fully confront it either. By the second week, I had grown accustomed to the rhythm, the patient insistence of the notes, the objects, the meals. They were no longer shocking. They had become part of the forest's quiet pulse, part of the clearing's deliberate rhythm. And yet each night, when the fog rolled in and the lanterns flickered in my cabin, I felt the subtle prickle of awareness, the delicate tension of being observed, recorded, noted. There was no urgency, no threat, only the quiet insistence that someone was there, patient, deliberate, and fully aware of every movement I made. One evening, I discovered a note tucked beneath the lantern on my porch. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, a little elegant in its loops and curls. It read simply, "You are beginning to understand." I held it in my hands, the weight of the paper heavier than its substance, and I realized I had indeed begun to understand. This presence was not violent, not hurried, not careless. It existed to observe, to acknowledge, to layer quiet attention over every moment of my life here. And in that understanding, the forest, the clearing, the neighboring cabin, they all became part of the same deliberate rhythm, a network of awareness that stretched beyond my perception. The final delivery that day was a small, carved figurine, left in the center of the clearing. It depicted a figure, kneeling, patient, deliberate, with arms outstretched in a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. I picked it up slowly, feeling the smooth wood against my fingers, and felt a strange sense of completion, a patient satisfaction in the observer's design. The forest held its breath around me, the fog curled softly, and I understood fully that I was being watched, observed, and noted, not with urgency or threat, but with patient, deliberate attention that would outlast me, that would persist in the rhythm of the forest long after I had left. That night I lay in bed and listened to the forest, the soft murmur of the creek carrying through the fog. The notes, the objects, the meals, all remained vivid in my mind, each a quiet echo of awareness and patience. The neighboring cabin was dark, silent, yet its presence lingered in my imagination, deliberate, patient, precise. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by the quiet tension of observation, the gentle insistence of an unseen presence recording every thought, every breath, every movement. And as I drifted into the rhythm of dreams, I knew that the forest, the clearing, the observer, and I were all bound together by this patient, deliberate awareness, subtle and unhurried, impossible to ignore. The final night settled over the clearing like a thick, almost tangible blanket, dark and heavy, pressing against my cabin walls and the edges of the neighboring forest. I had walked this clearing 100 times in my mind by now, tracing the rhythm of the fog, the way the shadows stretched in the moonlight, the faint flickers of the other cabin. Each movement had become predictable, measured, part of the quiet. Patient rhythm the forest imposed, but tonight felt different. Something in the air, subtle and deliberate, hinted that the balance I had grown accustomed to was shifting. I stepped outside slowly, boots pressing into the damp earth, careful not to disturb the delicate silence. The fog hung low, curling between trees, wrapping the clearing in soft, rolling coils of gray. My lantern cast a narrow circle of light, illuminating only a small portion of the space, leaving the rest for shadow and suggestion. I noticed immediately that the clearing seemed longer, deeper, stretched by the dark in ways I could not measure. Shadows had begun to twist subtly, shifting not with the moon or wind, but with a rhythm I could not name. As I moved closer to the neighboring cabin, the faint flickers I had observed before were gone, replaced by something different, a subtle, imperceptible movement along the edges of the clearing. At first, I thought it was the trees swaying with the breeze, but the motion was too precise, deliberate, almost anticipatory. My pulse picked up in a gentle, slow rhythm, not panic, only awareness that something or someone was moving across the space between us, careful, patient, deliberate, and utterly silent. I stopped midway, letting the lantern's soft glow illuminate the ground in front of me. A faint shadow crossed the clearing, vanishing almost as soon as I noticed it, leaving only the suggestion of presence, a trace in the fog. I squinted, eyes straining to parse the movement, to determine its source, to tell whether it was human, animal, or something else entirely. The clearing held its patience, the fog curling around me, a quiet accomplice in the game of observation. I felt that familiar prickle at the back of my neck, the soft insistence of awareness pressing at the edges of my mind. I whispered to myself, almost involuntarily, "Who's there?" The sound of my own voice seemed loud, clumsy, intrusive in the deliberate quiet of the forest. The shadow did not respond. It did not need to. The presence had already made itself known by its subtle manipulations, by the gentle stretching of fog, the precise rhythm of movement, the way the clearing felt alive with observation. I realized then that this was no ordinary neighbor, no ordinary cabin. This presence was patient, deliberate, and entirely beyond my understanding. I moved closer to the edge of the clearing, careful to keep my steps soft against the damp earth. Another shadow flickered at the periphery of my vision, disappearing when I turned to face it directly. I felt a strange combination of dread and fascination, a slow, creeping realization that the presence across the clearing might be more than human, or perhaps already long gone, leaving only the imprint of awareness behind. The forest, the fog, and the clearing seemed to conspire together, guiding my attention toward these vanishing shadows, patient and deliberate, letting me sense without ever fully revealing. I circled slowly, lantern held high, eyes scanning every inch of space I could see. Shadows darted briefly, just beyond reach, just beyond clarity, and I felt my mind stretch to fill the gaps, to imagine what might exist beyond perception. Was it human? A reflection of memory? Something that had lingered here long before my arrival? I could not know, and the forest offered no answers, only the patient weight of suggestion, subtle, deliberate, unhurried. The vanishing shadows were content to be glimpsed and then withdrawn, marking my awareness without confrontation. I found a large boulder near the center of the clearing and crouched behind it, letting the lantern rest on the mossy surface. The shadows moved again, slower this time, deliberate, shifting along the tree line, coiling through fog and darkness. I could see the faint outline of the neighboring cabin, windows dark now, walls blackened by age and moonlight. The flickers were gone, replaced by a subtle motion, almost imperceptible, as if the presence itself had melted into the night. I felt the patient gaze of something beyond comprehension, something observing the clearing in rhythm with my own movements, and I realized that this was the culmination of the pattern I had sensed all along. A soft wind stirred the fog, sending delicate tendrils curling over the ground, brushing my arms and face. I thought I glimpsed figures in those fog tendrils, shapes that lingered just beyond clarity, dissolving as I looked directly. They were not solid, not concrete, but their suggestion was enough to press awareness against my mind. I breathed slowly, deliberately, trying to steady my pulse, trying to reconcile the reality of the clearing with the illusions, or perhaps truths that existed only in shadow. The vanishing shapes did not hurry. They did not threaten. They were patient, deliberate, and haunting in their quiet insistence. I remembered the strange deliveries, the careful observations, the notes and objects left with deliberate care. They were a prelude, a subtle announcement that presence could exist without confrontation, observation without interaction, patience without urgency. The vanishing shadows now seemed to embody the same principle, a presence that stretched across space and time, patient and deliberate, marking awareness without violence. My mind wrestled with the possibility that I was witnessing something that existed on the threshold of comprehension, neither fully alive nor fully gone, persistent in the rhythm of the clearing. I rose slowly, moving toward the clearing's center, letting the lantern swing gently in my hand. Shadows moved with me, flickering, stretching, vanishing, reappearing. The clearing felt alive, breathing in a quiet rhythm with the forest, with the fog, with my own awareness. I realized that I had become part of this rhythm, woven into the patient, deliberate attention of the clearing itself. The vanishing shadows were not malevolent. They were observers, remnants, echoes of presence that had long outlasted my understanding. At one point, I paused to glance at the neighboring cabin. Its walls were blackened by moonlight, windows opaque with shadow. I felt that patient, deliberate gaze again, the faint suggestion of acknowledgement, a whisper of awareness that traced the rhythm of my own movement. Was it human? Had it ever been human? I could not tell, and perhaps the ambiguity was the point. The clearing, the fog, the shadows, the cabin, they existed in a careful balance of suggestion and perception, inviting observation, marking awareness, and withdrawing before understanding could solidify. The wind shifted again, sending soft rustles through the pine needles. A shadow darted across the clearing, slower now, almost hesitant. I held my lantern steady, letting the light fall in a narrow circle, and waited, patient, deliberate, mirroring the rhythm of the presence. The shadow paused, lingered, and then vanished entirely, as though aware that I had noticed, that observation itself was part of the ritual, part of the patient cadence of the clearing. I felt my pulse slow, my breathing deepen, and a strange calm settled over me, an acceptance of ambiguity, of the delicate interplay between observer and observed. Time passed without clear measure. I stood in the clearing, lantern in hand, watching fog curl, shadows stretch, shapes vanish. I understood now that this was the final night in a series of observations, the culmination of the quiet, patient rhythm that had marked my time here. The vanishing shadows, the flickering lights, the strange deliveries, All were facets of a deliberate awareness, subtle, patient, deliberate, impossible to fully grasp but impossible to ignore. The forest held its breath with me. The clearing waited. The shadows vanished and reappeared. And I realized that some presences, some truths, exist only at the edge of perception, patient and deliberate in their quiet insistence. Finally, I turned back toward my cabin, stepping slowly, letting the rhythm of my own presence merge with that of the clearing. I glanced once more at the neighboring cabin, dark, silent, patient, and knew that the vanishing shadows were not gone. They were patient, deliberate, and persistent, woven into the rhythm of the clearing, the fog, and the forest itself. I entered my cabin, the door closing softly behind me, and let the quiet settle over me like a soft, deliberate breath. Outside, the shadows moved, the fog curled, and the forest waited patiently, its awareness complete, subtle, and unhurried. The forest was dense, the kind of place that swallowed the last traces of daylight before the sun had fully disappeared. I had driven down a narrow, twisting dirt road for hours, the trees pressing close on either side, their limbs reaching like fingers toward the car as though curious, or perhaps impatient. By the time I arrived at the clearing I had scouted, the sky had deepened into a muted gray blue, and the shadows stretched long across the underbrush. I stepped out of the car and felt the air immediately, heavy, damp, thick with the scent of pine and moss. There was the faint tang of something older too, something earthy and decayed that clung to the forest floor. I carried my pack to the edge of the clearing where the faint outline of an old cabin stood, mostly hidden beneath pine boughs. It had clearly been unused for years. The wood was weathered, darkened, and scarred, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. Yet it seemed solid enough, and for tonight it would be home. As I set down my pack, the first subtle noises began. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than the forest settling, the trees creaking, small animals scurrying unseen. But there was a cadence to it, a rhythm that didn't belong to natural life. A faint tapping like someone drumming their fingers on the side of the cabin, far too deliberate to be a branch swaying in the wind. I paused, letting the sounds hang in the air, trying to catch their source. The forest remained still, save for the occasional whisper of leaves. Nothing moved, yet I could feel eyes, or something like eyes, pressing at the edges of awareness. I began unpacking slowly, careful to leave nothing out of place. Tent poles, sleeping bags, small lantern. I set the lantern on the rough wood porch, its soft glow reaching a few feet beyond the cabin, cutting through the thickening shadows. The forest seemed to exhale around me, and I realized I was holding my breath. Every small sound, the rustle of pine needles beneath my boots, the soft clink of metal against wood, was magnified in the quiet. The tapping had stopped, or perhaps it had simply become indistinguishable from the chorus of the forest at dusk. I lit a small fire in the stone pit just beyond the porch, letting the gentle warmth push back the chill that settled between the trees. Smoke rose slowly, mingling with the fog that had begun to roll through the clearing, twisting among the trunks. The firelight cast shadows that danced across the cabin's exterior, elongating the lines of the wood, making it seem both familiar and alien. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was filling in shapes where there were none. But the feeling of being watched remained, patient and deliberate, pressing at the edges of thought. As I arranged my supplies inside the cabin, the sounds returned. Soft, almost imperceptible like whispering voices, distant and out of sync with the forest. I paused mid-step, listening. The voices were faint, carried on a wind I could not feel, teasing the edge of hearing. I moved closer to the doorway, peering out, lantern in hand, but saw only the gentle sway of branches in the fog. No one. No movement beyond the occasional flash of shadow. Yet the sensation persisted. Attention, deliberate and patient, focusing on me, nodding every motion. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The fire outside crackled softly, the lantern flickered. I could hear the creek nearby, its water whispering against rocks, a soothing rhythm that contrasted with the subtle unease that pressed against me from every corner. The voices, or whispers, seemed to echo faintly through the fog, carried by the cool air, teasing at the edges of awareness without forming into words. I told myself to breathe, to remember that I was alone. And yet, alone in the forest does not always mean unobserved. Setting up my sleeping bag, I placed the pack beside it, checking that everything was in order. Small, simple motions, careful, deliberate, helped me maintain some sense of control. I could hear the gentle shift of the trees as the wind moved through, the forest breathing with a quiet patience that was almost tangible. And in that rhythm, I felt the presence again, not near enough to see, not far enough to ignore. A faint pressure on the senses, patient, deliberate, the subtle insistence that something was aware of me, waiting, watching. Dusk deepened into evening. The fog rolled lower, curling in delicate tendrils around the trees in the cabin. Light from my lantern stretched shadows long across the clearing, stretching and twisting the lines of the cabin, making it appear older, larger, more labyrinthine than it truly was. I found myself checking the corners of the room again and again, half expecting movement in the shadows, half hopping for nothing at all. The forest's patient rhythm pressed against my consciousness, mingling with the whispering voices that had yet to form a clear shape, a name, a face. I moved outside to close the fire, leaving only the lantern to mark my presence. The air was colder now, fog curling around my boots and ankles. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, soft but deliberate. I froze, listening. The whispering seemed closer, carried on a breeze I could not feel. It was faint, patient, unhurried, but unmistakable. I realized that the forest itself had shifted into a new rhythm, an awareness of me woven into its cadence, the trees and fog and shadows conspiring to create a subtle, deliberate pressure that settled in my chest. Returning inside, I closed the door quietly, letting the warm, dim glow of the lantern fill the cabin. I sat near the window, peering through the fog at the edge of the clearing, trying to reconcile what I had heard and felt with the reality of the night. There was no one visible, no figure, no flash of movement, yet the awareness persisted, patient and deliberate. Every rustle, every whisper, every shadowed shift seemed to confirm that this place was alive in ways I could not measure, a quiet observer marking my presence in its own slow, subtle rhythm. I tried to distract myself, unpacking the small supplies I had brought for the night, arranging them carefully, deliberately. Each motion, each action seemed to echo into the fog outside, as though the forest itself mirrored my attention. And in that reflection, I felt a strange connection, an uneasy intimacy with the unseen. The subtle whispers, the faint, unnatural sounds. They were not threats exactly, but acknowledgments, reminders that presence, patient and deliberate, can exist without confrontation, can observe without interacting. Finally, I prepared my sleeping bag, rolling it carefully and arranging my small lantern nearby. The fire outside had mostly died, the fog curling softly into the clearing, thick and unbroken. I lay down, listening to the soft murmur of the creek and the occasional shift of branches, the faint pressure of awareness pressing gently, deliberately, at the edges of thought. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by the quiet rhythm of whispers and subtle sounds, the forest holding its patient vigil, attentive to every breath, every motion, every heartbeat. And as I drifted into that slow, uneasy sleep, I understood that the clearing, the cabin, the forest, and whatever unseen presence watched from the shadows were now intertwined with me. A subtle, patient awareness that would mark the night, that would follow my dreams, patient and deliberate, impossible to fully comprehend but impossible to ignore. I woke to the soft patter of rain against the cabin roof, a gentle rhythm that should have been comforting, soothing. But the air felt heavier than usual, thick with dampness and something I couldn't name, a subtle, insistent pressure at the edge of my awareness. I lay in my sleeping bag for a moment, listening to the soft drip of water from the eaves, the occasional rustle of branches as the wind shifted, and I tried to ground myself in the ordinary. Rain in the forest was normal. Fog rolling through the clearing was normal. Shadows stretching across the cabin walls were normal. Yet, the feeling that I was being watched had not left me, and in that moment it seemed to sharpen. I unrolled myself from the sleeping bag, careful not to disturb the quiet. My lantern, which I had left on the floor, flickered weakly in the dim light, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Stepping toward the door, I noticed the floorboards creak softly underfoot, a reminder that even in solitude, the cabin responded to movement, as though it were aware. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the small porch, the damp wood cold beneath my boots. Outside, the clearing was shrouded in mist, the rain making the earth soft and malleable, the fog curling in lazy tendrils around the trees. Then I saw them, footprints in the mud, not faint, not ambiguous, clear, deliberate, wet impressions leading from the edge of the tree line directly to the cabin steps and stopping abruptly. I froze, breath catching in my chest. My mind raced to rational explanations. Someone had walked here last night. Perhaps a hiker lost in the fog, someone seeking shelter. But the forest had been empty when I arrived, the cabin isolated, hours from any trailhead or road. The prints ended at the porch, as if the visitor had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but their presence behind. I stepped closer, examining the mud carefully. The impressions were human, yes, but odd. The spacing was uneven, hesitant, almost careful, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them had been mindful of each step. No sign of weight beyond the subtle indentation of soles. I traced the edges with my finger, noting the way the mud had been disturbed, the small clumps of dirt clinging to the ridges. Something about the prints felt deliberate in a way that set my mind spinning. There was intention here, presence, and yet no one remained. I backed away slowly, letting my gaze sweep the clearing, but the fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. The trees stood silent, motionless, yet I could feel the weight of their patient observation. Every instinct screamed that I was not alone, that the forest itself had changed during the night, that it had acquired a quiet awareness that had not been there before. I returned to the cabin, closing the door softly, trying to convince myself that the footprints could be explained. Animals, perhaps. The ground was soft. Maybe the wind had moved branches in ways that mimicked steps. Rational thoughts, though, offered no comfort against the creeping awareness that something deliberate had come close to me. I tried to continue my morning routine, unpacking supplies and checking the small stove I had brought for coffee. Each small motion was deliberate, measured, almost ritualistic, as if keeping my mind occupied could stave off the growing unease. Yet even as I measured beans and poured water, I couldn't shake the memory of the prints, the way they ended abruptly at the porch, the subtle impression in the mud that someone, or something, had stood there, considered the cabin, and then withdrawn. The imagination, I told myself, would always exaggerate the forest's patience, the fog's persistence. And yet, the unease lingered, slow and deliberate, curling around my thoughts. I stepped back outside, drawn by some compulsion I could not name. Rain had eased to a light drizzle and the fog had thickened, curling like soft fingers around the trees and the cabin. I followed the footprints cautiously, my boots pressing into the wet earth, stopping where each impression had begun. Nothing. No one. No disturbance beyond the mud, no evidence of passage into the forest. Only the patient, deliberate calm of the clearing, as if the space itself had swallowed a presence whole, leaving only suggestion behind. I walked along the edge of the clearing, circling slowly, letting my eyes scan the shifting shapes in the fog. Every branch, every shadow, seemed to stretch with intention, waiting, observing. The forest felt alive in a subtle, deliberate way, responding to my presence as much as I was responding to it. The footprints had left an impression in the mud, yes, but their effect lingered in the air, in the fog, in the delicate pressure at the edges of perception that made my skin prickle and my mind race with possibilities. Returning to the cabin, I paused at the threshold, feeling the soft dampness of rain against my jacket. I leaned against the doorframe, listening. The forest held its quiet rhythm, a branch snapping far off, water dripping from leaves, the low whisper of the creek somewhere deeper in the trees, and beneath it, subtle but insistent, a presence that pressed against my awareness. I realized then that the footprints had not only marked the earth, they had marked me, had imprinted the notion of attention, observation, and deliberate patience. Whoever had left them had done more than walk. They had made me aware, and that awareness lingered. Inside, I sat near the window, lantern casting gentle circles of light. My mind circled over the footprints, the deliberate spacing, the way they ended at the porch. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I was alone, but the forest's quiet rhythm contradicted that notion. The fog shifted subtly, and in its folds I imagined shapes, figures that vanished when I looked directly, suggestions of presence just beyond clarity. I could not see them fully, could not name them, but I knew somehow that I had been observed, that I was still being observed, and that the forest had learned to wait. Time became ambiguous. I moved about the cabin in slow, deliberate motions, making coffee, arranging my gear, checking the door and windows. Each sound, each small motion seemed amplified in the quiet. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, curling around the cabin like a patient visitor. And somewhere beneath the fog, in the soft impressions in the mud, in the absence of any clear figure, there was awareness, a deliberate presence that did not need to show itself to be felt. My imagination twisted and pulled at it, tried to assign form or intent, but the forest remained patient, deliberate, and silent. Eventually, I sat down on the floor, lantern beside me, tracing the outline of the cabin walls with my eyes. Shadows stretched and twisted in the soft light, merging with the folds of fog outside. I thought of the footprints again, their careful spacing, the way they had ended, the subtle suggestion that someone had paused, considered the cabin, and then withdrawn. And I understood slowly that the forest, the fog, the shadows, and whatever had walked here were not separate. They were part of the same patient rhythm, the same deliberate awareness that pressed against me now, weaving together observation, anticipation, and subtle dread. The rain eased completely. A soft wind stirred the fog, curling it like fingers around the porch. I could hear the faint murmur of the creek, steady and soothing, yet beneath it, a whisper of tension, a patient insistence that awareness was still present, just beyond reach. The footprints had been more than evidence. They were an invitation, a reminder that the forest, patient and deliberate, had noticed me, and that it did not need to act in order to make itself known. I leaned back against the wall, eyes drifting toward the fog outside, listening to the subtle symphony of the forest. The footprints remained in my mind, precise, deliberate, ending abruptly at the porch, and in that ending they had left an impression deeper than the mud. Awareness lingered, observation lingered, and I knew that the forest, patient and deliberate, would continue to watch, would continue to mark its presence, without sound, without movement, without confrontation. As I closed my eyes, trying to rest in the cabin's dim light, I imagined the footprints stretching back into the fog, trailing into the unknown, marking paths I could not follow. And in that imagination, the forest pressed close, patient and deliberate, a presence that would not relent, a quiet insistence that observation can exist without explanation, that awareness can persist without form, and that the clearing, the cabin, and I were now part of the same subtle rhythm, quiet and unhurried, deliberate and patient. I woke in the half-light of early evening, the cabin quiet except for the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. Sleep had been fragmented, filled with uneasy dreams that I could not quite place, memories I didn't recognize but somehow felt real. For a long moment I lay still, listening. The rain had stopped, leaving only the soft, persistent drip of moisture from the eaves. Beyond that, the forest was quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. I pulled myself upright and stretched slowly, feeling the stiffness of sleeping on the cabin floor. My lantern flickered faintly, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. In the quiet, I thought I heard something else, a murmur, soft and indistinct, like the echo of a conversation carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear. At first, it was easy to dismiss, the wind weaving through branches, my imagination playing tricks. But the murmur persisted, subtle, deliberate, repeating a cadence that hinted at words, at meaning. I got to my feet and moved closer to the window, peering into the fog that had returned to the clearing. The mist curled around the base of the trees, soft and ethereal, making familiar shapes strange and alien. I could see nothing at first. Then, as I focused, I thought I caught movement, a subtle shift in the shadows, not enough to make out form or figure, but enough to suggest presence. And in that stillness, the whispers became clearer, echoing faint phrases I could not fully understand. Words from the past, half-remembered stories, perhaps the remnants of crimes long buried, carried to me on the wind. The thought sent a shiver along my spine. I had read about the history of this forest, old accounts of vanished hikers, of cabins abandoned in haste, of trails where people simply disappeared. At the time, those stories were distant, academic. Now, standing here, listening to whispers that seemed to drift from the trees themselves, they felt immediate, urgent, as if the past had not remained behind but had pressed forward, settling over the clearing like fog. I moved slowly around the cabin, careful not to make a sound. Each step seemed magnified in the quiet, each small movement echoing through the dim light. The whispers continued, faint fragments of dialogue. A name repeated, the sharp intonation of warning, a soft, half-choked exclamation. I could not place them, could not understand them fully, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, confusion, helplessness. I imagined the lives behind those words, the people who had walked these woods and never returned. The thought made my stomach tighten, the shadows in the room seeming to stretch closer, pressing gently, deliberately, against the edges of perception. I approached the small fire pit outside, still faintly warm from the night before, and let my hands hover over it, warming them. The whispers seemed to change with my movement, flowing and curling through the fog, soft and persistent, deliberate in their presence. I tried to speak aloud to break the spell, but my voice sounded strange, too loud in the stillness, and the murmurs shifted, retreating slightly as if recoiling from sound, only to return when silence returned. I realized then that the forest itself was a kind of echo chamber, carrying fragments of old voices, old fears like sediment in the air, waiting to be heard. I took a seat near the cabin wall, lantern casting a warm circle of light. I focused on breathing slowly, deliberately, trying to calm the nervous tension in my chest. Yet the whispers did not cease. They ebbed and flowed, rising and falling like the tide, sometimes just beyond comprehension, sometimes forming a word or phrase before dissolving again. Don't follow, stay away, behind you. I could not tell if these were warnings, memories, or the twisted fabric of imagination drawn from the forest itself. Hours passed in this delicate rhythm. Every movement outside, the wind, the drip of water, a branch snapping, was mirrored by subtle shifts in the whispers. They seemed tied to perception rather than physical reality, responding to thought, attention, awareness. I realized that the forest had become alive in a new way, not through motion but through the persistent echo of past horrors. Each whisper was a fragment of history, a residual emotion, carried like a ghost in the damp air, brushing against the mind, pressing at the edges of thought. I tried to focus on something else, my supplies, the fire, the small rituals of camp life, but it was impossible. Each sound, each shadow drew me back into awareness of the whispers, back into the subtle dread that pressed over the clearing. The words remained just beyond full understanding, teasing the mind, feeding the imagination, leaving uncertainty where clarity should have been. I thought of the vanished hikers, of the cabins left behind, of the old reports that hinted at something older and crueler than mere misfortune. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. For a moment I thought I saw movement just at the corner of my eye. I held my breath, letting my gaze settle. Nothing. And yet the whispering intensified, growing faintly louder, more insistent, threading around me like an invisible thread. I could feel it tugging at memory, at fear, at the edges of sleep. The presence of past lives, past terror, settled around me, patient, deliberate, almost affectionate in its persistence. I rose slowly and moved to the window again. Fog swirled thickly, curling around trees and underbrush, and I felt a pull to step outside, to follow, to seek the source. Something in me, rational and frightened, resisted. I could see the world clearly enough in the lantern light within the cabin, but beyond, the fog transformed everything. Each tree became a silent witness, each shadow a potential observer. The whispers seemed to drift from them, as if each trunk and branch had absorbed stories long ago, now sharing them only with those willing to listen. I settled back near the lantern, letting its gentle glow bathe the room in warmth. The whispers softened, fading into an almost musical undertone, a cadence I could not decipher but felt in my chest. I understood then that these voices were not active threats. They were echoes, remnants of fear, confusion, and suffering, carried by the forest to those who would hear. They lingered not to harm, but to remind, to mark the clearing as a space of memory, of presence, of subtle, deliberate watchfulness. Sleep came slowly, reluctant, layered with half-formed words and half-remembered cries. I drifted in and out, aware always of the whispers, the subtle pressure of history pressing through the fog. In dreams, the voices became clearer, forming faint shapes of figures, faces obscured and shifting, their expressions frozen in fear, confusion, or sorrow. And always beneath the dream, the forest remained patient, deliberate, silent in the way that only memory and time can be. Morning light, when it came, filtered through the mist and the trees, gentle and pale. The whispers had not vanished entirely, but receded into a background murmur like the last sigh of the night. I moved carefully, tending my supplies, making coffee, checking the small lantern. Yet I knew as I watched the fog curl and shift that the voices were still there, patient, deliberate, woven into the forest itself, ready to rise again when dusk returned, when shadows lengthened, when attention faltered. And so I remained, careful in motion, deliberate in thought, aware that the clearing, the cabin, and the whispers of past lives were intertwined now with me. I had entered as an observer, a visitor, but the forest had marked me, patient and deliberate, leaving traces in memory and awareness, echoes that would follow, soft and insistent, as long as I remained within earshot of its patient, deliberate presence. The wind had calmed by nightfall, leaving the forest in a stillness so deep it felt almost unnatural. I lit a single candle on the rough wooden table in the corner of the cabin, its flame trembling softly, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. There was a quiet beauty in the glow, comforting at first, until the shapes began to suggest something more. The shadows seemed to gather, pooling in corners and along the ceiling beams, forming angles and contours that my mind could not quite name. I settled into a chair, close enough to the candle that its warmth brushed against my hands. The air smelled faintly of wax, wood, and damp earth from outside. I tried to focus on that, on grounding myself, repeating a slow, steady mantra in my mind. I am here, I am safe, I am alone. Yet, even as I whispered those words internally, I could not ignore the sense that the cabin itself was attentive. The shadows shifted ever so slightly when I looked away, subtle movements that suggested life, intention, or perhaps memory, lingering in the space long after those who had passed were gone. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A creak from the floorboards, a soft sigh through the chimney flew, and then faintly the whispering returned, not from outside, not from the forest, but from within the cabin itself. The candlelight flickered, and with each tremor I imagined faces emerging in the dark, etched into the walls, contorted in sorrow, fear, and regret. They were not clear, not fully formed, but suggestions, impressions, hints of lives that had intersected with this place long before I arrived. I leaned forward, straining to focus. The whispers were fragmented like scraps of conversation carried on the air, a name here, a plea there. The tone always the same, quiet, intimate, burdened with guilt or fear. I could not make out full sentences, but I understood the emotional content, the weight of past actions, the lingering traces of pain, echoes of choices that had left scars both visible and invisible. The cabin was speaking in its own patient way, through shadows and flickering light, confessing the tragedies it had absorbed over decades. I shivered, not from cold, but from the slow, deliberate understanding that I was witnessing memory itself. Candlelight seemed to bend reality here, stretching time and space until the line between now and then blurred. I imagined the people who had sat in this very room, travelers seeking shelter, couples drawn by the promise of isolation, a lone wanderer like myself. Each left traces behind, not just in footprints or discarded belongings, but in emotion, in the subtle pressure of presence that seemed to seep into the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the cabin wished to ensure its confessions were heard. I moved closer to the wall, letting my fingers hover above the rough wood, feeling its texture, its grain. For a moment, I thought I felt something beneath my fingertips, a faint vibration, a pulse of memory, carrying a story I could not yet understand. The candle flickered violently, and in that brief flare of light, I glimpsed the shadow of a figure, seated where no one sat, slumped as if carrying a heavy burden. The outline dissolved as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the soft rhythm of my own breathing and the faint, persistent murmur of confession in the air. I sank back into the chair, letting the candlelight bathe my face. The flickering cast shadows that merged with the folds of the room, creating shapes that suggested movement, life, and sometimes anguish. I realized that the cabin held stories not written in books or diaries, but etched into its very timbers. Each corner, each beam, each mark in the walls seemed deliberate, intentional, a witness to the passage of lives and the echoes of their choices. I felt both privileged and burdened, a voyeur to experiences that had never been meant for my eyes, yet unavoidable in their insistence. The whispers began to form patterns, fragments of sentences that my mind began to assemble into a tapestry of quiet horror. I should not have, never left, waiting for. They were gone. Each fragment suggested loss, regret, unfulfilled promises, and the inevitability of consequence. I could not tell who had spoken, when, or under what circumstances, only that the weight of these confessions pressed down with a gentle, patient inevitability, as if the cabin itself remembered better than anyone else could. Time passed in a fluid, almost irrelevant way. I lit another candle to push back the shadows, but the additional light did not diminish the feeling of presence. Shadows only multiplied, deepened, grew more intricate, suggesting that the confessions were not dependent on visibility, that memory and emotion could manifest independently of light. I felt the pull of exhaustion, my eyelids heavy, yet I could not rest. The stories were insistent, demanding attention, drawing me into a careful listening that was both fascinating and terrifying. I stood, moving slowly to a small table stacked with old papers, maps, and objects left by previous visitors. Each item seemed to carry its own memory, its own subtle aura of presence. A map was folded carelessly, corners worn and water-stained. A journal lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with small, meticulous handwriting. I traced the words with my eyes but could make out only fragments. Mentions of paths through the forest, travelers who had never returned, notes about fear and anticipation. The candle flickered again, and I could almost feel the cabin nudging me to pay closer attention, to absorb what it had witnessed over decades. I returned to my chair, letting the candlelight dance across my hands. The whispers shifted, more coherent now, almost like voices practicing confession, rehearsing long-suppressed truths. I imagined the people speaking, a hiker who had strayed from the trail, a couple arguing over directions, a solitary traveler feeling the first tendrils of fear curl in their chest. The cabin had listened, had absorbed their emotional residue, and now it offered these confessions to any who would sit and bear witness. I could feel the emotional weight settling around me, a quiet heaviness that made my limbs feel leaden. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, trying to center myself in the candlelight and the soft murmurs of the forest outside. The confessions continued, unbroken, weaving a tapestry of sorrow and regret that transcended time. I understood then that the cabin did not wish to harm. It only sought acknowledgement. Its confessions were not loud, violent, or aggressive. They were gentle, deliberate, carried in the flickering shadows, in the pauses between words, in the quiet insistence of presence. Listening was the only requirement, and I was willing. Hours passed in this delicate rhythm. Candlelight trembled, shadows shifted, whispers ebbed and flowed. I let myself drift, aware that sleep would come in fragments, but that the presence of the past, the weight of confessions, would remain patient and deliberate around the corners of my mind. Faces and names coalesced in dreams, sometimes fading when I tried to hold them, sometimes lingering long enough to press a quiet weight upon my chest. I welcomed it in a way, for it reminded me that the forest and the cabin were alive with memory, alive with quiet insistence that past tragedies were never truly gone. They simply waited for attention, for acknowledgement, for witness. Finally, exhaustion claimed me entirely, and I allowed myself to fall into a tentative sleep. The candle burned low, casting shadows that whispered softly over the walls. And even as I drifted, the confessions continued, carried in the flickering light, in the gentle sway of shadows, in the subtle, deliberate presence that had claimed the cabin and now me. I slept not in peace, but in careful awareness, cocooned in candlelight, shadow, and the persistent memory of lives that had intersected with this place long before mine. I woke to the soft, gray light of early morning, or at least I thought it was morning. The sky beyond the cabin windows had a pale, milky hue, as if the sun had not fully risen, or had risen only to be swallowed by fog and shadow. The forest outside was silent, the kind of silence that is heavier than stillness, pressing against the edges of thought, making the smallest sound seem magnified. I lay for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first I told myself it was the wind settling, the trees shifting in the cold, the usual noises of nature. But then I became aware of something else, subtle and deliberate. A feeling, almost a presence, hovering just beyond the walls, watching. I could not see it, could not name it, but I could feel it, patient and quiet, waiting. I realized that this was not simply fear of the dark or the unknown. This was something older, something that had been here long before me, that lingered even as the candlelight from the night before had burned low and died. I rose carefully, moving slowly, letting my hands brush against the rough wood of the cabin walls. The floorboards creaked softly, betraying my presence, and yet the oppressive stillness remained. The shadows were longer now, stretched thin across the walls by the diffused light outside, and they seemed to shift subtly as I moved, as if adjusting in response to my awareness. I lit a lantern, and its glow fell in a soft circle, revealing the familiar interior, yet nothing seemed normal. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying a damp, earthy scent and something else I could not name, a trace of the past pressed into the room itself. I went to the window and peered into the forest. The fog curled between the trees, thick and unyielding, masking details and creating the illusion of movement. I thought I saw a figure, a shadow that moved against the natural rhythm of the branches, but when I blinked it was gone. My pulse quickened, not in panic, but in a deliberate, creeping awareness of the unknown. The forest had become a living memory, and I was just beginning to understand that presence here was not accidental. I returned to the table, my fingers brushing over the small items left behind. Notes, scraps of paper, a cup still damp with condensation. Each object seemed imbued with an almost imperceptible weight, the residue of past intentions and emotions. I imagined the hands that had held them, the minds that had written the notes, the fears and small triumphs they carried. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing gently, a patient weight that could not be escaped by hiding, by turning away, or by ignoring it. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, unseen but all-seeing, and it had chosen me as its audience. The whispers returned, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the sighing of the wind. But I recognized them now, voices from the past, lingering in the corners of the cabin, in the folds of shadow, in the spaces between thought and perception. They spoke in fragments, repeating phrases I could not fully comprehend. Waiting, always watching, never gone. I could feel the rhythm of their presence, a subtle insistence, like fingers brushing along the edges of memory, pulling me into awareness of things I had not yet seen but somehow knew existed. I walked to the edge of the clearing, stepping carefully over wet earth and tangled roots. Each step seemed to echo in the fog, magnified by the silence, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes, deliberate and patient, tracking me. The feeling was not immediate threat but persistent observation, the kind that seeps into the mind and refuses to leave. My imagination began to spiral, imagining watchers in the trees, figures crouched behind trunks, shadowy outlines just beyond the edge of vision. Every sound, every subtle shift in the fog became evidence, proof that the forest was alive with attention. I stopped and closed my eyes, trying to calm my breathing to focus on rational thought. But even as I did, fragments of the past surfaced, names of hikers who had vanished, stories of cabins abandoned in haste, accounts of people who had claimed to hear whispers in the trees. It was all here in the fog, in the damp earth, in the way the forest seemed to bend perception and time. I understood that dawn in this place was not a deliverance. Light did not chase away shadows. It merely illuminated them, made them sharper, more deliberate. The whispers became more insistent, layering over each other like threads in a tapestry I could not untangle. You see them, they wait, they remember. Each fragment brushed against my mind, and I felt the weight of countless observations, countless small tragedies pressing from every direction. I realized then that I was not alone, not in a physical sense, but in a temporal one. The forest, the clearing, the cabin, the fog, all of it carried memory, and memory carried presence. The watchers of the past were patient, deliberate, unhurried, and I had entered their domain. I returned to the cabin, my lantern swinging softly. The interior seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as if the light from outside could not penetrate the accumulated weight of memory that had settled over the room. I moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the walls, the corners, the furniture. I could feel the presence in every surface, in every whisper of air, as if the cabin itself were breathing history into me. The candle from last night had burned low, leaving only wax drips and faint smoke residue. I lit a new candle, but even the flame seemed inadequate, flickering against the oppressive awareness that filled the room. I sat near the window, looking out over the clearing. Fog wrapped the trees like a shroud, concealing details, suggesting movement, hinting at watchers just beyond comprehension. My mind conjured shapes, figures half-formed, faces frozen in fear, anticipation, or sorrow. Each flicker of imagination felt like recognition, as if I were seeing echoes of those who had come before, trapped in loops of memory that never ended, repeating their last moments endlessly in the stillness of the forest. Hours passed, though I cannot be certain how many. The forest remained patient, deliberate, unchanging in its weight. The whispers continued, subtle and layered, interwoven with my own thoughts, threading through my dreams even as my body rested. Sleep was fragmented, filled with visions of figures at the edge of perception, gestures half understood, eyes that watched but never blinked. I felt the forest's presence pressing on me from all directions, constant yet soft, insistent yet nonviolent. By the time the light shifted, pale and weak through the fog, I realized I had become part of this rhythm, part of the ongoing observation. I was no longer merely a visitor. I was an audience, a witness to patient attention that transcended time. The dawn had come, but it had not lifted the weight of awareness. I could see more clearly, yes, but the sense of being observed, of being remembered, of being folded into a history I could not escape, remained. I stood slowly, moving through the cabin, aware of every shadow, every surface, every whisper of past voices. The forest, the clearing, the cabin. They waited patiently, deliberately for attention, acknowledgement, recognition. The watchers were not aggressive, not malevolent in a traditional sense. They were remnants of memory, echoes of lives that intersected with this place, persistent enough to leave traces in perception, in thought, in the slow, deliberate unfolding of time. I knew then that dawn would never truly come here. Light might illuminate, might shift perception temporarily, but the presence of past lives, of memory, of patient observation, could not be dispelled. It would remain softly, insistently, like the persistent whisper of wind through trees, like the echo of footsteps that no one could trace, like the subtle, deliberate weight of awareness that had claimed this clearing and now claimed me. I sat by the table, letting the candle burn low again, and listened. The whispers were softer now, intertwined with the rhythm of my own breathing, but they had not stopped. I understood that they would not stop, that the forest, the clearing, the cabin, the watchers, they were patient and deliberate. And I was part of their attention now, a temporary participant in the endless observation that stretched beyond my understanding, beyond dawn, beyond light. The night outside had settled into a soft, almost tangible quiet. The trees around the cabin swayed gently in the wind, their branches scraping one another in a sound that was more whisper than groan. I had been sitting near the small fireplace, a single lamp burning low beside me, when it came, the knock. At first I thought it was the wind, perhaps a branch brushing against the wooden door. But then it came again, slower this time, deliberate, measured. 3 knocks. I froze. My hands, resting on my knees, stiffened. My mind raced, sifting through possibilities, a lost traveler, some local playing a prank, an animal perhaps, but none of these seemed to fit. The knock had a rhythm that suggested awareness, intent, as if someone, or something, knew exactly where I was and had chosen this moment to announce itself. I rose slowly, each step cautious on the uneven floorboards. The cabin smelled of pine and aged wood, mixed with the faint tang of my own unease. The lamp cast long shadows that trembled across the walls as I approached the door. My hand hovered over the latch, fingers trembling slightly, and I felt a strange hesitation. Not fear exactly, though it was close, but an almost physical awareness that this was no ordinary visitor. I opened the door a fraction, just enough to peer outside. The night was empty. The forest pressed in around the cabin, dark and patient. The fog that had been creeping through the clearing seemed thicker now, curling around tree trunks like slow-moving smoke. I stepped out onto the small porch, the chill air wrapping around me, and saw nothing. Not a figure, not a movement, not a hint of presence beyond the ordinary sway of branches. And yet on the threshold a small piece of paper had been left. Its edges were damp from the dew, curling slightly as if reluctant to be noticed. I picked it up with tentative fingers, careful not to tear it, and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was neat, careful, almost painfully deliberate. The message was brief, cryptic. "You are not alone. Listen." The words sat in the air like a weight. My mind struggled to place them, to interpret them, but there was no context, no explanation. The handwriting did not match anything I had seen before, not a tourist's scrawl or a local's hurried note. It felt older than the cabin itself, as though it had been written with knowledge of the place I had only just arrived in. I slipped it into my pocket, uncertain whether it was a warning, a taunt, or something else entirely. I stepped back inside, closing the door carefully behind me. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, thickened with anticipation. The cabin felt different somehow, as though the act of leaving that note had awakened something that had been dormant in the walls. I lit a candle and placed it near the door, watching the shadows flicker along the floorboards, and for the first time I felt truly observed. Hours passed, though time felt distorted. I could not shake the feeling of eyes tracing my movements, subtle, patient, unyielding. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind through the trees seemed amplified, purposeful. I tried to read, tried to distract myself with the mundane tasks of unpacking and organizing my supplies, but my mind kept returning to the note, to the knocks, to the sense that I had stepped into something beyond ordinary understanding. I moved through the cabin slowly, tracing my fingers along the walls, over the rough grain of the wood. There was a sense of history here, not just in the cabin itself, but in the way the shadows clung to corners, in the way the air seemed to hold memory. I imagined the people who had lived, or perhaps merely passed through, this place before me. I imagined their routines, their worries, the quiet tragedies that left traces too subtle to see but too persistent to ignore. As the night deepened, the feeling of presence became more distinct. I could almost sense it moving, circling, waiting, patient yet deliberate. I dared not speak aloud, for fear that sound might draw attention, or perhaps for fear that my voice would acknowledge something I was not ready to confront. I moved to the window and peered out into the fog, straining to detect any movement, any hint of a figure. But the forest remained still. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft and close as if carried by the air itself. "Listen." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was insistent but gentle, like a memory trying to reach through time. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart, and tried to convince myself it was imagination, that it was merely the combination of fear, isolation, and the fog that played tricks on the senses. I walked to the corner of the room where the candlelight barely reached and sat, trying to center myself. The note lay beside me, its words still visible in the lamplight. I stared at them, reading and rereading, hopping for some revelation, some clue as to what I was meant to hear or understand. The cabin seemed to breathe around me, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched my own pulse, and I felt the walls closing in ever so slightly, pressing memory, history, and presence into my awareness. Time became a blur. Minutes passed like hours, hours like moments. I heard every creak, every groan of the wood, every sigh of the wind, and each sound carried weight, meaning, intent. I imagined footsteps in the shadows, imagined figures that were never fully formed, faces that shimmered at the edges of perception. I dared not move, for fear that motion would draw notice, or perhaps for fear that stillness was safer in a place where the past lingered so insistently. By some measure of exhaustion, I eventually lay down on the cot near the corner. The candle flickered, sending shadows across the walls, forming angles that suggested movement, presence, and memory. I pulled the blanket closer, feeling the weight of the night, the fog outside, the cryptic message in my pocket. Sleep came slowly, fragmented by whispers, by imagined footsteps, by the sense of being observed and recorded, noted by eyes I could not see but somehow knew existed. Even as I drifted, the cabin seemed alive, aware, patient. The knocks at the door, the cryptic note, the feeling of eyes tracking me, they were not simply events. They were invitations, gentle and insistent, to witness, to listen, to become part of the space's long memory. And I realized as consciousness faded that the night had only just begun. I slept lightly, dreamless yet restless, aware that someone or something was waiting, that the cabin had chosen to share its awareness with me, and that the knock, simple and deliberate, was not an end but a beginning. The morning had a muted quality. The sunlight filtered through thick curtains, diffused and weak, as if reluctant to enter the cabin. I wandered through the narrow hallway, my footsteps soft against the worn floorboards. The air smelled faintly of dust, wood polish, and something older, something that lingered long after its origin had vanished. Along the walls, portraits hung in tarnished frames, their glass scratched and foggy. I stopped before the first one, peering into the faded image of a young man in a suit, his eyes almost seeming to follow me as I moved. There was something off about these portraits, something more than age or fatting. Each face seemed frozen in a quiet tension, as if they had been captured in a moment of fear, hesitation, or expectation. The more I looked, the more I felt that these weren't merely photographs or paintings. They were records of presence, echoes of people who had occupied this space before me. Some smiled faintly, some stared blankly, and some had expressions I could not quite read, caught between resignation and something darker, something that hinted at stories that had never been told. I traced my fingers along the frame of one portrait, feeling the smooth wood under my skin. The dust had settled into fine patterns, almost deliberate, and I realized that the portraits themselves seemed to pull attention, drawing me into their gaze. I felt a shiver crawl along my spine. A thought came unbidden. Had these visitors ever left? Or were they still here in some form, lingering in the shadows of memory, bound to this cabin and its long, quiet history? I moved slowly down the hallway, my eyes scanning each image. There was a woman in a dark dress, holding a small book in her hands. Her gaze was steady, almost accusing, and I felt the weight of her attention press against me. I imagined her whispering, recounting events I could not hear, moments of despair or perhaps terror that had been preserved in paint and varnish. Each portrait was like a frozen witness, and I realized with growing unease that I had become the audience, the one who observed in place of the long-gone figures who had once roamed these halls. Some of the faces were familiar in a way I could not explain. I would catch myself thinking I recognized a smile or the tilt of a head, but then the memory would slip away, leaving only the impression of acknowledgement. The effect was subtle, almost imperceptible but cumulative, like a slow erosion of the boundaries between past and present. I felt the history of this cabin pressing against me, quiet and deliberate, making the air heavier, the shadows longer. A small desk sat against one wall, cluttered with yellowed papers and ink-stained notes. I approached, brushing aside the dust, and found that some of the documents were records of the cabin's occupants, names, dates, brief accounts. Many ended abruptly, leaving only fragments. Others contained cryptic remarks, phrases like left without warning or never seen again. My stomach tightened as I realized the patterns. People had disappeared here, vanished without explanation, their stories frozen only in the echoes of these notes and the eyes of the portraits. I returned to the hallway, pausing before a portrait of an older man. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow yet piercing, and I felt a distinct shift in the room's atmosphere. The air seemed colder, as though a draft had passed over me from nowhere. I imagined his life, the days spent within these walls, the nights of restless sleep, perhaps the nights of unspeakable events. I felt the pulse of his memory in the room, a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat, subtle and insistent. The thought was unsettling, not because of fear of the man himself, but because the sense of time in this place had become slippery, and I could feel the past brushing against my present with deliberate care. I walked the length of the hallway again, trying to focus on rational explanations. Perhaps the portraits were simply old. Perhaps the expressions were coincidences of light and age. Perhaps the papers and notes were remnants of a routine now forgotten. But each rational thought was countered by the weight of awareness pressing from every corner. The small shift of shadows, the faint creak of floorboards behind me, the low, almost imperceptible rustle of air that suggested something moving just out of view. The hallway seemed to contract as I walked, stretching and narrowing in a way that was impossible yet undeniable. I paused before a portrait of a child, a small girl holding a doll, eyes wide and unblinking. I could almost hear her breath, the soft intake of air that carried curiosity, fear, and sorrow in equal measure. Her gaze lingered on me longer than any of the others, and I felt the unmistakable weight of observation, as if she were measuring my intentions, evaluating whether I belonged in this space. The sensation was not violent, not threatening in a conventional sense, but insistent, patient, and impossible to ignore. I moved past her slowly, every step deliberate, listening to the soft creak of the floor and the low hum of my own breathing. The air felt alive, filled with subtle movements that I could not identify. Perhaps it was the building settling, or the wind outside, or perhaps something else entirely. The thought made me uneasy, but also strangely alert, as if each shift in the shadows, each faint whisper of the air, carried information I had yet to decipher. At the end of the hallway, I found a small door, partially hidden by the corner of a wall. I approached it cautiously. It was old, paint peeling, hinges stiff with disuse. I hesitated before touching the handle, feeling the weight of what might lie beyond. The portraits had prepared me, I realized, for an awareness of the unseen, for the sense that memory and presence were bound to this place in ways I could not fully comprehend. I drew in a slow breath and opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I paused at the top, my hand resting on the railing. The air was colder here, heavier and faintly musty, carrying the scent of earth and age. The shadows at the base of the stairs seemed to pulse slightly, responding to my hesitation, and I felt an almost imperceptible tug, a gentle insistence that I continue. The portraits, the notes, the echoes of past visitors, all of it seemed to converge here, drawing me toward an experience I could not yet name. I took the first step down and then another, each movement deliberate, careful. The darkness below was absolute, yet it did not feel threatening. Rather, it felt patient, aware, waiting. I could almost hear the faintest whispers, fragments of conversation from decades past, merging with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I realized then that the cabin did not merely contain memory, it preserved it. maintained it, and perhaps in some subtle way demanded acknowledgement. I descended slowly, the creak of each step amplified in the tight space. The walls seemed to close in, or perhaps I was simply more aware of their presence. I could feel the weight of the portraits above, their gazes following me even as I left the hallway. I understood with a deep, subtle unease that the cabin's history was layered, deliberate, patient, and that each person who had come before had left traces, echoes, whispers that could not be erased. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was cooler, damp with the scent of earth and something faintly metallic. The shadows here were deeper, more insistent, and I felt a distinct pressure, as if the memories stored in the cabin had concentrated in this small space, waiting to be encountered, observed, and acknowledged. I realized then that I had become part of this long record, a witness among witnesses, a temporary occupant of memory and presence that would outlast my own stay. I stood in the darkness for a long moment, listening. The whispers were faint now, fragments of phrases I could almost understand. Never left, watch, remember. Each word seemed to hang in the damp air, curling around me, weaving into the rhythm of my own thoughts. I felt simultaneously small and connected, isolated yet part of something vast, deliberate, and patient. The portraits above had prepared me. The hallway had guided me. And now I was confronted with the depth of the cabin's memory in a space that seemed untouched by time. I lit a small lantern I had brought with me, the soft glow illuminating the walls around me. The space was narrow, lined with old wooden beams and rough stone. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, drifting like tiny spirits suspended between past and present. And though the air was still, I could sense motion, faint and deliberate, just beyond perception. I understood then that I was not merely exploring the cabin. I was participating in its long, deliberate preservation of presence, memory, and attention. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of the hallway, the portraits, and the hidden history converge around me. The air was thick with awareness, patient and deliberate, yet strangely comforting in its persistence. I realized that I had entered a space where the past lingered insistently, and where observation itself was a form of interaction. The portraits had watched, the notes had spoken, and now the cabin itself seemed to acknowledge my presence, quietly, deliberately, and without judgment. I stood there for a long time, absorbing the atmosphere, listening to the faint whispers and feeling the weight of memory settle around me. The hallway, the portraits, the shadows, they were all part of the same deliberate consciousness, a patient record of lives and events that refused to be forgotten. And I understood, finally, that in this cabin, one could never truly leave. Even as I moved, even as I breathed, even as I imagined returning to the ordinary world outside, I was already woven into its persistent awareness. The evening had settled over the forest like a soft, dark blanket, muffling the world beyond the cabin. The air smelled of damp pine needles, wet earth, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. I had been packing the small interior, trying to keep my mind focused on mundane tasks, arranging firewood, checking the lantern, straightening the few belongings I had brought with me. But the forest outside seemed to hum with a subtle presence, a quiet insistence that made every ordinary sound feel amplified, every shadow alive. I first noticed it while sitting near the cabin window, gazing into the trees. At first, it was nothing more than the faintest tapping, almost imperceptible, like branches brushing against one another. I paused, listening, trying to place the sound in my mind. The creak of a limb in the wind, perhaps, or the settling of some distant structure. But then the tapping continued, deliberate, measured, a rhythm that didn't belong to the natural order of the forest. My chest tightened, a slow pulse of unease that had nothing to do with danger in the ordinary sense, and everything to do with presence. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to see past the shadows. The trees were dark silhouettes, swaying gently, their movements almost hypnotic. And then I heard it, a soft crying, distant at first, faint and fractured, like the echoes of a child lost somewhere deep in the woods. The sound was barely there, but unmistakable. It made me swallow hard, a lump forming in my throat, as my mind struggled to reconcile what I was hearing with the quiet, empty forest I could see. I stood slowly, careful not to make sudden movements that would betray my unease. I wanted to convince myself it was imagination, the mind playing tricks in solitude, amplifying minor noises into something meaningful. But the tapping continued, now more insistent, echoing lightly from a distance I couldn't measure. The crying too persisted, layered with the rhythm of the tapping, creating a strange, almost musical cadence that was both haunting and incomprehensible. I felt my pulse match the irregular rhythm, slow and quick, unsettled, drawing me closer to a state of acute awareness I could not escape. I approached the cabin door, considering stepping outside to investigate, and then hesitated. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed deeper, more absolute than the evening should have allowed. I imagined the forest as a living entity, observing me, aware of my attention. Each movement of the branches, each whisper of wind, carried subtle suggestion, as if the woods themselves were trying to guide my perception. The sounds, tapping, crying, did not seem to originate from a single source, yet they were localized enough to feel directed, intentional. I returned to the window, pressing my palms flat against the cold glass. My reflection merged with the shadowed trees, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement behind me, small, fluid, and almost imperceptible. I spun around, heart thudding, but the cabin remained empty, still, and familiar. I told myself it was nothing, yet the sense of being watched persisted, quiet, patient, unrelenting. The crying continued, a low, broken sound that tugged at something deep in my chest. I realized I had been holding my breath and exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself in the mundane. I was alone, the forest was vast, and my imagination had long been known to wander in subtle, unsettling ways. I decided to step outside. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth as I moved across the porch. The tapping grew louder, more rhythmic, but still impossibly subtle, almost as if it were aware of my approach. The crying seemed to shift in distance, fatting and swelling, a living thing that evaded me. I found myself walking slowly along the narrow path, guided by instinct and the faint light of the lantern I carried. Every step was deliberate, measured, yet my mind raced with possibilities from the logical, an animal, a trapped bird, to the impossible, something more enduring, more aware than the forest itself should allow. The trees were close now, their trunks tall and dark, forming a dense wall around me. The tapping moved among them, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never remaining in one place long enough to locate. And the crying, it was closer now, yet distant, impossibly layered. My own ears seemed to betray me, registering echoes that didn't exist, sounds that were both immediate and unreachable. I stopped, listening with my whole body, trying to distinguish reality from imagination, and felt a cold, wet brush of wind against my neck that made my hair prickle. I imagined the source, someone, something moving quietly among the trees, but there was no sound of footsteps in the soft earth, no broken branches, nothing to betray a physical presence. And yet the rhythm of the tapping, the cadence of the crying, insisted on a presence, deliberate, aware, and almost patient in its observation. I felt my hands tighten around the lantern, the warmth of the flame a small comfort, yet not enough to dispel the creeping sense of unease that had settled over my shoulders. I moved slowly forward, each step measured, trying to follow the cadence of the tapping. The crying shifted again, almost imperceptibly, as if guiding me deeper into the forest, and I realized with a rising chill that I did not know where I was headed or why. My mind flitted between explanation and impossibility. Perhaps I was hearing the forest itself, resonating with the memory of those who had walked here long before me. Perhaps I was simply alone, my senses heightened by fear, amplifying faint noises into meaningful patterns. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too consistent to dismiss entirely. A fallen tree lay across the path, its roots twisted and slick with moisture. I stepped over it carefully, mindful of my footing, and as I moved I became aware of another sound, a faint whisper, so light it could have been the wind. I froze, heart thudding, trying to discern its content, but it was impossible. The whisper seemed layered with intention, a subtle modulation of tone that made me feel observed, measured, acknowledged. It was neither threatening nor friendly, only insistent, as though the forest itself had something to communicate, and I was expected to receive it with attention. I stopped, breathing shallowly, and looked around. The trees were still, though the darkness between them seemed to move, to shift with an awareness of its own. The tapping had grown fainter, retreating, yet persistent, a heartbeat hidden within the forest. The crying, however, had grown more distinct, closer, yet still elusive, drawing my attention, tugging my thoughts in multiple directions at once. I felt a sudden vertigo, a disorienting blur between expectation and perception, as if the forest were reshaping itself to my awareness. I realized I had been walking in circles. The lantern's light fell on familiar trees, familiar shadows, yet nothing looked precisely the same. The tapping and crying seemed to respond to my confusion, weaving around me, layering in ways that were impossible to map. My pulse quickened, not with fear of attack, but with the profound, unsettling awareness that the forest was alive in a way I could not understand, aware, patient, and deliberate. I whispered aloud, my voice small, tentative, "Who's there?" The sound seemed swallowed immediately, leaving the forest silent except for the persistent echo of tapping somewhere deep within the trees. The crying softened, almost mournful, as if acknowledging my presence but remaining distant, untouched, and unreachable. I realized then that I was not meant to confront this presence, only to notice it, to acknowledge its existence without expectation of understanding. Time became slippery. Minutes stretched into indistinct hours, the soft sounds layering over one another, merging with my own heartbeat, my own breathing. Each tap and cry felt like a word, a fragment of a sentence I could almost comprehend, yet never fully. My mind wavered between reasoning and surrender, between rational dismissal and the reluctant acceptance that something beyond ordinary perception was aware of me, observing me, testing the boundaries of my attention. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, steps slow, deliberate, weighted with the awareness that the forest was not empty. The crying faded with distance, but the tapping persisted, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing from within the shadows themselves. I closed the door behind me, the familiar latch offering a fragile sense of security, yet I knew it was temporary. The forest had spoken in its subtle, insistent way, leaving traces in my mind that would not vanish, patterns of presence and absence that would linger long after the night passed. I settled near the fire, trying to collect my thoughts, to anchor myself in the tangible world of warmth, light, and sound I could measure. But the echo of the tapping, the layered sadness of the crying, remained insistent in my imagination, patient in its persistence. I understood then that the forest had not changed, and I had not imagined entirely. Something was out there, something aware, subtle, deliberate, patient, waiting for me to notice without needing to be seen. Even as I drifted toward restless sleep, I could hear it, faint, distant, and impossibly deliberate. A reminder that some presences are not violent, not immediate, but persistent, patient, and eternal in their quiet observation. The line between imagination and reality had blurred, leaving me with awareness alone, a slow, creeping understanding that I would carry with me, long after the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the cabin windows. The cabin had grown quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, settling like dust over every thought. I had been wandering from room to room, trying to distract myself from the unease that had been growing steadily since I arrived. The walls, darkened with age, seemed to breathe softly, shifting imperceptibly, as if aware of my presence. I had just finished stacking firewood by the small stove when something caught my eye, a slight unevenness in the floorboards near the corner of the room. At first I dismissed it as nothing more than settling wood, but my curiosity tugged at me, insistent and persistent. I knelt down and pressed my fingers against the boards, feeling the subtle gap beneath them. It was just enough to suggest something hidden below. My heartbeat quickened, a slow drum of anticipation and unease as I tried to push rational thought forward. Perhaps it was a storage compartment, a forgotten crawl space, something mundane. And yet the air around it felt heavier, cooler, as if it had been breathing quietly beneath the floor for years. I found an old iron latch, hidden under a thin layer of dust, and hesitated. The quiet in the cabin had grown so profound that even my own breathing seemed loud, intrusive. My hand hovered over the latch for a long moment, drawn to it but hesitant, aware of a shadowed history in every creak of the wood. Finally, I lifted it, and the floorboard shifted with a soft groan, revealing a dark opening that descended into the unknown. A faint chill rose from the cellar, carrying the scent of damp earth, mold, and something I couldn't name, something faintly metallic, bitter, and unsettlingly human. I shined my lantern down, the light cutting through the darkness, revealing a narrow staircase leading into shadows. Each step I took was careful, deliberate, the wood creaking softly under my weight. The air grew cooler as I descended, pressing against my lungs with a gentle insistence that made me shiver. The cellar opened into a low, square room, just barely wide enough to move comfortably. My lantern revealed walls lined with dusty shelves, crates stacked haphazardly, and objects that seemed both ordinary and impossible. I stepped forward cautiously, my mind attempting to categorize each artifact. Faded photographs in cracked frames, journals with brittle pages, jars filled with indistinct substances, and tools whose purpose I could not discern. Each item seemed to carry a weight, a silent testimony to lives that had once passed through this place, now long gone. I picked up a small journal, its cover worn and discolored. The pages were filled with tight, hurried script, recounting mundane details at first, meals, weather, visitors. But as I read further, the tone shifted, becoming fragmented, anxious, paranoid. The writer mentioned sounds in the walls, shadows moving at night, whispers in the dark that no one else could hear. I felt a chill run through me as I realized these were the same sensations I had been experiencing. The tapping, the faint crying, the subtle awareness of being observed. The journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted by some unseen force. I placed the journal back carefully, moving along the shelves with measured steps. Each artifact seemed to hum with the presence of the past occupants, their lives frozen in dust and decay. A jar caught my attention, filled with a dark liquid and something small coiled inside. I recoiled slightly, stomach twisting, yet I could not look away. It was a memento, a record, or perhaps a warning, some relic of human behavior that had been preserved, intentionally or not, in the cellar's shadowed depths. The floorboards above creaked faintly, and I froze, listening. The sound was subtle, barely more than a vibration underfoot, but it reminded me that I was not entirely alone. Or perhaps, I thought, it was a memory of the cellar itself, echoing past presences. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, stretching and contorting objects into strange, impossible shapes. I felt my pulse quicken, a slow drum of unease that resonated in my chest, and I realized that I was experiencing the cellar as it had experienced me, observing, absorbing, and waiting. I moved toward a corner where a small crate lay partially open. Inside were remnants of food, utensils, and clothing, evidence of previous inhabitants. But there were also scraps of paper, photographs, and personal items, a child's toy, a broken watch, a rusted key. Each item carried a story I could only imagine, the lives of those who had stayed here, who had vanished, or perhaps had been hidden intentionally. I ran my fingers over the surfaces, feeling the texture of decay and time, the silent imprint of human presence long past. I stepped back and the cellar seemed to respond. Shadows deepened, shapes shifted, and the faintest whisper reached my ears, almost imperceptible, like a voice carried on the walls themselves. I strained to listen, catching fragments of words, fleeting images in my mind. Do not leave, see, wait. The sense of being observed intensified, pressing against my senses with subtle insistence. I realized then that the cellar was not simply a room, but a repository of attention, of awareness, capturing and reflecting every presence that had ever touched it. I explored further, discovering a trapdoor in the far corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of crates. The wood was old, fragile, and coated in dust. I pressed my hand against it, feeling a faint vibration beneath my fingers, a subtle thrum that seemed to pulse with life. My mind raced, imagining what could lie below. More relics, another hidden space, or something darker, something waiting silently for discovery. The cellar was layered, complex, its history woven into the very fibers of its structure. A sudden draft swept through the room, stirring dust and loose papers. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that seemed almost to move independently of the objects they accompanied. I swallowed, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle over me, a quiet, patient pressure that pressed on my chest and made each breath deliberate. I was aware of my solitude, yet I was not alone. The presence of those who had come before, of the cellar itself, lingered around me, patient and observant. I returned to the shelves, inspecting jars and containers with increasing caution. Each item seemed to hold fragments of life, pieces of existence preserved in a manner both careful and careless. I imagined the hands that had placed them here, the minds that had catalogued, hidden, or discarded them. And in that imagining, I felt a creeping empathy, mingled with fear, for the lives that had brushed against this place, and for my own presence now, weaving into the complex fabric of observation and memory. I paused near a stack of old boards leaning against the wall. Beneath them, faint markings were visible on the floor, scratches, scuffs, depressions in the wood that suggested movement, struggle, or care and concealment. I crouched, tracing the lines with a careful finger, feeling the grooves, the subtle irregularities that hinted at action long ago. The cellar spoke in these marks, telling stories in ways I could not fully interpret, yet felt in the pit of my stomach, in the slow, insistent tightening of unease. Time seemed to stretch in the cellar. Each sound, each flicker of shadow, each faint whisper of the past became magnified, layered, woven into a tapestry that I could only partially perceive. I moved from corner to corner, cataloging objects, listening for echoes, absorbing the subtle signs of previous lives. My thoughts drifted, imagining the stories of those who had come here before me, their fears, their routines, the reasons for which they had hidden things, and perhaps the consequences of discovery. Finally, I ascended the staircase slowly, lingering at each step as if part of me feared leaving the cellar behind. The weight of the hidden room pressed on my shoulders, a reminder that some histories are preserved not for our understanding, but for their own continuity. The air at the cabin's main floor felt lighter, warmer, yet the awareness of the cellar, its silence, its observation, followed me like a shadow. I knew even then that the artifacts, the whispers, the remnants of the past would remain with me long after I left, seeping into dreams, thoughts, and the quiet moments when the mind is most vulnerable. I settled near the small stove, trying to focus on mundane tasks, arranging wood, lighting a candle, sipping lukewarm coffee. But my mind kept drifting back to the cellar, to the objects, to the faint traces of voices and hands long gone. The tapping I had heard in the woods, the faint cries, the shifting shadows, they all seemed connected to this hidden room, layered memories that refused to be contained. I realized then that the cellar had changed me. Not violently, not overtly, but subtly, persistently, by drawing attention to the thin boundary between observation and intrusion, between presence and memory. Every artifact, every shadow, every whisper was a reminder that the forest, the cabin, and the hidden spaces beneath them were alive with the imprint of past lives. And now, I too had become part of that quiet, patient archive. I finally allowed myself to rest, leaning back against the wall. The lantern flickered softly, the shadows danced quietly, and I felt the gentle weight of awareness around me, subtle, patient, and ever-present. The cellar had whispered its stories, not through violence, but through presence. The persistent, quiet sense of memory and attention that lingers long after the last light fades. And as I drifted towards sleep, I knew that the echoes of the hidden cellar would remain with me, gentle yet insistent, a slow reminder that some histories are never truly silent. The morning light had always seemed like a relief to me, a kind of gentle reassurance after a long night. But not this morning. The sun, though rising above the treetops, did little to pierce the heavy canopy that pressed over the cabin, nor did it illuminate the sense of unease that had taken root deep in my chest. I awoke with the faint taste of iron in my mouth and the lingering echo of footsteps, mine or imagined, still pressing against the wooden floorboards of the cabin. I tried to tell myself that the cellar, the hidden rooms, the journals and remnants had been the source of my disquiet, that if I simply left them behind, I could reclaim the calm I had felt the first evening I arrived. But the forest has a way of reaching into your thoughts, bending time and perception until the line between past and present, reality and imagination, begins to blur. I dressed slowly, my movements deliberate, aware that every creak of the floor, every brush of sleeve against wall, sounded far louder in this still waiting place. Stepping outside, the cold morning air greeted me, biting at exposed skin and carrying with it the damp smell of pine, moss, and fog that had begun to curl lazily along the edges of the clearing. I squinted, trying to discern shapes in the soft, shifting gray, and that's when I saw them, or thought I saw them, just beyond the tree line. Shadows. Tall, thin, and impossibly still, lingering at the threshold where the forest met the clearing. For a moment, I convinced myself it was the trees themselves, their trunks stretching in the angled light, their branches casting long, spindly shapes on the mist. But something about their placement, the subtle sway that seemed almost deliberate, made my stomach knot. My breath caught, shallow and hesitant, as I realized I was not merely being observed by the forest, but by something or someone that existed between the folds of shadow and light. I returned to the cabin door, lingering in its frame as if it could shield me. The door itself, though ordinary, felt like a threshold in more ways than one, an entrance to the known world of the cabin and an exit to the unknown expanse beyond. The forest had always seemed to listen, but now it felt like it had begun to speak, its voice not in sound but in posture, in the slow, patient waiting of unseen eyes. I tried to recall the day before, every step I had taken, every artifact I had touched. The cellar's dark corners, the hidden crawlspace beneath the floorboards, the faint whispers from objects that had no right to carry memory, all of it pressed on my mind. And now, this new presence, this lingering sense of shadows at the edge of vision, compounded that unease. I felt as if the forest itself had exhaled, revealing a secret that it had long kept hidden from careless eyes. I moved cautiously to the edge of the clearing, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and the shadows seemed to respond, shifting imperceptibly. Not toward me exactly, but acknowledging me, existing in tandem with my awareness. It was impossible to tell whether they were human, spectral, or a trick of the morning fog. I tried to reason, telling myself that the mind plays tricks in isolation, that my imagination had been cultivated over nights of solitude, fear, and whispered echoes. Yet reason offered no comfort. I took a step closer, and the shadows mirrored me, not directly, but in movement, in posture, a subtle, uncanny mimicry that felt both deliberate and detached. My pulse quickened, though I tried to breathe slowly, carefully, reminding myself of everything I had learned in the cabin. To observe, to catalog, to exist within the tension without letting it overtake me. But even as I reminded myself, I felt the creeping weight of dread pressing across my shoulders, a physical sensation that made my limbs heavy and my thoughts sluggish. I considered retreating, returning inside and shutting the door against the forest, but a part of me resisted. The presence outside demanded acknowledgement. Whether they were human, spirit, or a trick of the trees, I had trespassed in a space that was not entirely mine. And now, at this threshold, I understood that leaving quietly would not erase the footprints of memory I had already placed. The shadows remained, still at the boundary, their edges blurred by the lingering fog. I noticed faint hints of movement within them, subtle flickers that suggested depth and dimension beyond the simple shapes of the trees. My eyes strained, trying to parse detail, but each attempt was thwarted by the interplay of light and mist. It was as though the forest was teaching me patience, guiding me to understand the nature of observation, of awareness, before revealing its secrets. I thought about the cellar beneath the cabin, about the hidden histories I had touched, and realized that this was an extension of the same phenomenon. Just as the objects had held the presence of past lives, the forest held the presence of things unseen, waiting to be acknowledged but never fully revealed. The shadows at the threshold were a living echo of memory and attention, a slow testament to the forest's vigilance and the human instinct to probe what is hidden. I moved back toward the cabin, my steps deliberate, each one weighted with the knowledge that I was now part of a network of attention and observation. The shadows did not follow me in a straightforward manner, but their existence was a constant pressure, a presence at the periphery of vision that reminded me that solitude is never absolute in such a place. Even as I crossed the clearing, the sensation of being watched never left, a whisper along the spine, a tension in the air, a reminder that thresholds are not simply boundaries. They are interfaces between worlds, between histories, and between the seen and unseen. Inside the cabin, I shut the door slowly, listening to the faint sigh of the latch and the subtle vibration of wood settling. The shadows at the threshold were no longer directly visible, but their influence lingered, pressing subtly against the edges of my awareness. The air within felt charged, alive with the residue of observation, both my own and that of the forest. Even as I moved from room to room, examining objects or attempting mundane tasks, the presence of the threshold remained, a quiet insistence that nothing here was entirely inert. I sat near the window, watching the fog curl along the trees, and realized that the forest had become a kind of mirror, reflecting not only the physical world but the interior landscape of my mind. The shadows were a projection, perhaps, of my own fears and anticipations, but no matter how I rationalized it, they carried weight, substance, and attention. I could feel the forest's awareness pressing gently against my consciousness, a patient, persistent pressure that refused to be ignored. As the day progressed, I explored the cabin once more, tracing familiar steps through rooms I had previously cataloged. The cellar, the hidden crawlspaces, the journals, the scattered artifacts, all of them resonated with the same quiet awareness I had felt outside. The forest's threshold had become a node in a larger network of memory and observation, each element interconnected with the others. My own presence was woven into it now, and I was acutely aware that leaving would not erase the imprint I had made. By afternoon, the sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, and shadows deepened inside and outside the cabin. I noticed subtle movements along the edges of the clearing again, slight flickers that might have been wind or light, or might have been the same silent figures I had observed earlier. My skin prickled with the slow, creeping realization that the forest's attention was not constrained by the limitations of human perception. It existed beyond the bounds of reason, a patient observer of both life and the traces left behind. Evening approached, and with it, a heavier stillness. I lit a small candle, letting its soft glow illuminate the interior, casting long, tentative shadows across the walls. The forest beyond the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply aware. I considered leaving, taking the path back to the road, back to civilization, but the sense of threshold lingered. I knew that some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be fully retraced. My presence, my attention, had been recorded in subtle ways, leaving impressions on both the cabin and the forest beyond. Night fell slowly, folding the clearing and cabin into darkness. The candle flickered, throwing gentle shadows that danced in quiet rhythm, echoing the movements I had perceived outside. I felt the persistent pull of the threshold, a reminder that the unseen world, the forest's memory, and my own presence were inextricably linked. Sleep beckoned, but even in the embrace of rest, I knew the shadows would remain at the edges of perception, patient, silent, and insistent. As I lay down, the darkness of the room felt different from the darkness outside. Here, it was filtered through walls, candlelight, and my own awareness, yet I could sense the threshold at all times. It was there in the corners of my vision, in the faintest whisper of wind against the window, in the soft settling of the cabin. I realized that thresholds are never simply entrances or exits. They are the spaces where past and present, observation and presence converge. And in that convergence, I understood the final lesson the forest offered. Some shadows are not threats. Some shadows are witnesses. And sometimes the most chilling presence is not what stands in front of you, but what waits patiently, quietly, just beyond the threshold, observing the lives that cross into its domain. I drifted slowly into sleep, the candle guttering softly beside me. Outside, the shadows remained at the edge of the clearing, quiet, patient, and alive in ways my mind could not fully comprehend. I knew, even as my eyelids closed, that the forest's attention had claimed a part of me, and that the threshold would endure long after I left, holding memory, awareness, and the quiet, persistent weight of what cannot be fully seen.